Once upon a time, in a quiet little town where the sun shone bright and the birds sang sweetly, something strange began to happen. People started receiving mysterious invitations, and no one knew where they came from. These invitations were for a funeral, but they had no names or addresses. Just a simple card, plain and white, with only the words, "You're invited." Imagine getting a card like that. What would you think? Would you be scared, curious, or maybe a little of both? As the days went by, the townsfolk whispered to each other about the invitations. Some laughed it off, saying it was just a silly prank. Others felt a chill run down their spines. It was unsettling. It was as if something dark was creeping into their peaceful lives. One day, a man named Thomas received an invitation, just like everyone else. He was a kind man, always helping his neighbors and smiling at children. But when he saw that card, a shiver ran down his back. He felt drawn to it, as if it was calling his name. So, he decided to go to the funeral. He thought, maybe it's just a mistake. Maybe it will be interesting. Little did he know that this decision would change his life forever. When Thomas arrived at the cemetery, he was puzzled. It was empty. Not a single soul was there. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass. The air felt heavy, almost as if it was holding its breath. In the center of the cemetery stood a single coffin. Thomas's heart raced as he approached it, and there, engraved on the wood, was his name. What could this mean? Was this some kind of joke? Thomas felt a knot in his stomach. He looked around, but there was no one to ask. The silence was deafening. Suddenly, he heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Was someone watching him? He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the wind whispering through the trees. After that strange day, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He went home, but sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, wondering who had sent the invitation and why. The next morning, when he opened his mailbox, there it was again, a new invitation. This time, it was more decorated, with dark flowers and a silver border. It simply read, "Tomorrow, the empty funeral awaits you." Each day brought a new invitation, each more elaborate than the last. Thomas felt trapped in a nightmare. He tried to ignore it, but the invitations kept coming, each one drawing him closer to the cemetery. The townsfolk began to notice his change. He was no longer the cheerful man they knew. He was pale, tired, and always looking over his shoulder. One evening, as Thomas sat alone in his living room, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it slowly, heart pounding. No one was there, but on the porch lay another invitation, this one stained with something dark. He picked it up, and as he did, he felt a cold breeze sweep past him. It sent chills down his spine. That night, he dreamed of the coffin. In his dream, it opened, and he saw himself lying inside, eyes closed, as if he were asleep. He woke up gasping. The image burned into his mind. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the next invitation, waiting for the funeral that felt too real. The next day, he decided to confront the mystery. He went to the cemetery again, determined to find answers. As he walked through the gates, the air grew colder. The trees seemed to whisper secrets, and the ground felt uneven beneath his feet. He approached the coffin, heart racing. This time he opened it. Inside, he found a mirror. Looking into the mirror, he saw not just his reflection, but shadows behind him. They were dark and twisted, reaching out as if trying to pull him in. He stumbled back, terrified. The shadows whispered his name, echoing through the empty cemetery. "Thomas, Thomas." He turned to run, but the shadows followed, swirling around him, pulling him back toward the coffin. He fought against them, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the invitations rustling in the wind, each one a reminder of his fate. The ground beneath him felt like it was sinking, like he was being swallowed by the earth itself. Just when he thought he couldn't escape, he remembered the townsfolk. They had to know something. He raced back to town, breathless and panicked. He burst into the local diner where everyone gathered. They looked at him surprised. "What's wrong, Thomas?" they asked, concern etched on their faces. He told them everything, the invitations, the coffin, the shadows. But instead of helping, they looked at him with fear. "You shouldn't have gone. one whispered. "You should have stayed away." He felt a chill run down his spine. What did they know that he didn't? With each passing day, the invitations continued, each one more urgent than the last. Thomas felt like he was losing his mind. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The shadows were always there, lurking in the corners of his vision. They whispered to him in the night, promising him peace if he would just let go. Finally, he decided he had to go back to the cemetery one last time. He needed to face whatever this was. As he stood before the coffin, he felt a strange calm wash over him. Maybe if he accepted his fate, the shadows would leave him alone. He reached for the coffin, ready to embrace the darkness. But as he opened it, instead of finding himself, he found a book. It was old and dusty, with pages yellowed by time. He opened it, and inside were names of people who had received the same invitations throughout the years. Each name was followed by a date, and next to some were the words "gone" or "forgotten." Panic surged through him. He was not the first. He would not be the last. He slammed the book shut and turned to run, but the shadows were waiting. They wrapped around him, pulling him down into the earth. He screamed, but no sound came out. As he was pulled deeper, he saw the faces of those who had come before him, their eyes wide with fear. They were trapped, just like him, lost in a cycle of invitations and empty funerals. He realized then that this was not just about him. It was about all the forgotten lives, all the souls lost to the shadows. With a final surge of strength, Thomas fought against the darkness. He remembered the townsfolk, the laughter, the joy of life. He screamed their names, calling them to remember him, to remember the lives they had lived. As he did, the shadows began to weaken. But it was not enough. The darkness pulled him back, deeper and deeper, until he could see nothing but black. The last thing he felt was the cold earth closing in around him, the weight of forgotten lives pressing down, and the echo of his own name fading into silence. And so, the empty funeral continued, waiting for the next curious soul to wander in, to receive the invitation that would lead them to their own demise. The shadows would always be there, whispering, waiting for someone to listen. And in that quiet little town, life went on, unaware of the darkness lurking just beneath the surface, ready to claim its next victim. So, dear listener, as you lay down to sleep tonight, remember Thomas and the empty funeral. Be careful of the invitations you receive in life, for some are better left unopened. And as you drift off, keep your eyes open for the shadows that might be watching, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be free of darkness. The night after Thomas was pulled into the earth, the town fell quiet. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the pavement. No one noticed that one of their own was gone. Mothers tucked their children into bed. Fathers read the newspaper, and the world seemed blind to the darkness lurking just outside. But in the cemetery, things were different. The air was thick, and an unnatural fog rolled in, wrapping around the tombstones like cold fingers. The shadows stirred, restless and hungry, whispering to one another in voices that rustled like dead leaves. They had claimed Thomas, but his absence left a void, a hunger that not even they could ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the invitations continued to arrive in the mailboxes of the unsuspecting townsfolk. Slowly, fear began to seep into the town's heart. People spoke in hushed tones about the empty funeral and the missing man. Many dared not to attend, but some, driven by curiosity or a sense of obligation, found themselves drawn to the cemetery. One by one, they arrived, clutching their own invitations. Those details, the chilling words, "You are invited." The once bustling cemetery began to fill with the nervous murmurs of new visitors, echoing in the desolate silence. They exchanged worried glances, unsure if they were truly supposed to be there, yet unable to resist the pull. The sky turned dark as clouds gathered overhead. Raindrops began to fall, heavy and cold, each drop a reminder of the dread that loomed. Inside the cemetery, the shadows grew bolder, swirling and twisting around the frightened guests. Eyes darted around, scanning the area, searching for signs of Thomas or some ghostly figure that might explain the eeriness they felt. Then, there it was, a sudden gust of wind, sharp and fierce, knocking over a flower vase by an old tombstone. The guests jumped, heart rates climbing. As they looked closer, they noticed not just flowers, but the soil disturbed, as if something had pushed up from beneath. Breathless with fear, they huddled together, sharing anxious glances. It felt wrong. It felt alive. One woman stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "We have to find out what's happening here," she said, her voice shaking. She approached the disturbed grave, reaching down to touch the dirt. As her fingers sank into the soil, a chilling scream erupted from behind her. A man had seen something that caused his face to pale. "What is that?" he shouted, pointing toward a creeping darkness that seemed to ooze from the ground itself, tendrils reaching up like fingers seeking a grip. The group froze, terror rooted deep in their hearts. The darkness shifted, and soon familiar shapes began to emerge. Faces of those who had come and gone before, trapped in a silent scream, eyes wide with horror. They were not alone. The cemetery had claimed many, and now their spirits stirred in the depths of the shadows. Suddenly, the air filled with a cacophony of whispers, rising in urgency. "Leave this place," they cried. "It's not safe." But fear held them in place, and they felt themselves being pulled closer to the shadows, compelled by an unseen force. Panic surged through the crowd as they stumbled backward, a frantic rush. But the shadows were faster, wrapping their tendrils around ankles and wrists, trying to pull them into the dark. They struggled, fighting against the pull, but the cemetery felt alive, almost sentient. The ground shook slightly, and graves cracked open, revealing empty coffins with nothing but dirt inside. From those empty spaces arose more whispers, echoing from beneath the earth. "Join us, they urged, like a siren song that grew louder with every heartbeat. Each heartbeat pounding like a war drum. As the guests fought to break free, the woman who had first approached the grave fell, her scream cut short as the ground swallowed her whole. The earth closed quickly behind her, as if it had never been disturbed. The others gasped, eyes wide, realizing they were now mere players in a horrific game. They grabbed each other, forming a chain, trying to keep from being separated. Now united in fear, they began to retreat, step by trembling step, but the shadows were relentless, rising higher, engulfing the light. The sun vanished behind the clouds, plunging the cemetery into darkness, as if the night itself had come alive to claim them. "Run!" someone shouted, and they all began to sprint toward the cemetery's gates. But the gates had changed. The usual stone arches now appeared twisted, grotesque, as if kissed by decay. The path seemed to stretch longer, mocking them, the exit far away. The sky roared, thunder rumbling like a beast awakening from slumber, further casting them into despair. As they neared the gates, a figure emerged from the shadows. Not just any figure, but Thomas. His eyes were hollow, skin gray, and stretched taut like a canvas. No longer the man they remembered, but a shell, a ghost of what was once vibrant and full of life. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, a voice a mere echo of his former self. Some cried out, others froze in fear. "Help us," they shouted, but he merely stood there, trembling, tears streaking down his ashen cheeks. He pointed back at the darkness that had claimed him, his expression warning them of the terrible fate they would face. Then the shadows surged forward, swallowing him whole, his desperate cries echoing in the night. They felt the chill wrap around them like a malevolent embrace, as fingers of darkness wrapped tighter. The realization washed over them. Thomas was lost. The shadows had him, and soon, unless they escaped, they would be next. With newfound determination, they turned as one and began running, pushing past fear, even as the shadows clawed at their heels. They could the sound of something following them, an odd rustling that seemed almost human. But when they dared to look back, the shadows simply laughed, mocking them with twisted grins. Alarms rang in their minds. The exit loomed closer, but it seemed to pulse, alive and unreachable. They could hear more voices now, lost, wandering, calling out not just for help, but beckoning others to join their cursed existence. "Join us," they wailed. "You will never leave." As they neared the gates, one last person stumbled, falling from the group. The shadows dove upon them, tangled in darkness. Some reached back instinctively to help, but hesitation struck, freezing them in their tracks. Could they afford to risk their lives? It was a choice, a sacrifice, or to run to safety. Huddled together, they made their decision. The remaining townsfolk pulled together, refusing to let another friend fall into darkness. They formed a human chain and wrapped their arms around one another. They pulled with all their might. Each ounce of strength was devoted to pulling the fallen friend back from the depths of despair. But the shadows were strong. They twirled and twisted, fighting back against the chain of friendship. Terror filled their hearts as they watched the darkness clawing and wrapping itself around their fallen friend. Frantic gasps erupted as the smell of damp earth filled their noses, blending with the icy breath of the shadows. Desperately, they yelled for the one caught in the abyss. "Hold on," they shouted, a mantra that urged their friend not to succumb to dark whispers. "We won't let go. Just a little more." The shadows screamed back, vowing to claim them all, their whispers a chilling cacophony that filled the air with dread. With one final mighty heave of will, they yanked the friend free. Gasping and trembling, they fell backward into a huddle, hearts racing, adrenaline pumping. But the shadows were not done. They surged forward with a force they seemed to draw from the earth itself. The darkness hissed with malice, desperate to reclaim what it thought was rightfully its own. "Go! Now!" Someone screamed, and the frightened group scrambled toward the archway. They could feel the weight of the darkness behind them, the terrible fingers clutching at their clothes, their hair grasping for the last threads of hope. As they burst through the gates, the shadows howled in anger, a wind sweeping through the cemetery that rattled the branches above. The townsfolk stumbled into sunlight, their hearts pounding with the realization that they had escaped, at least for now. From behind them, they could still hear the whispers, but only faintly, for they were safe outside the cursed gates. However, the sense of relief was short-lived. They looked back to see the cemetery still, but there, standing where Thomas once had been, was a new invitation. Their names engraved in the same eerie script, surrounded by the haunting promises of the shadows. "You are invited," it proclaimed, a nasty smile lurking in the depths of darkness. The group stood frozen, knowing they weren't truly free. Reality hit like a brick. The shadows hadn't forgotten them, nor had they broken their bond. They were still in danger. As night fell over the town, uncertainty loomed larger than ever. They had escaped the cemetery, but the darkness had planted its seeds firmly inside their minds. Desperate to understand, they regrouped, each one haunted by Thomas's fate, sharing fearful looks with one another. Their restful lives turned into frantic discussions about how to confront this nightmare and find a way to break the curse that threatened them all. But in their exhaustion, doubt crept in, whispering that maybe they were already too late. With the growing urgency, they decided to visit the local library, seeking old records and stories. Perhaps hidden in the pages of history lay clues on how to defeat the shadows. The town had its secrets buried deep, and they needed to uncover those tales before they ended up as just another set of names etched upon a haunted coffin in the cemetery. As they entered the library, the scent of old paper filled the air. They scoured books, flipping through dusty pages filled with local lore. Each story seemed more bizarre than the last, as if the town had its own dark legacy. Shadows, spirits, unsolved mysteries. Everything they read only led to deeper unease. Hours passed, and the group grew tired. One of them stumbled across a dusty, old book too large to ignore. It was leather-bound, cracked with age. The spine bore titles of forgotten rituals, unsettling rituals that invoked the dead. They opened it cautiously, and the pages crumbled slightly. Their eyes widened as they read about a ceremony meant to break curses, one that required the use of personal items belonging to those who had received the invitations. Items tied to Thomas and others claimed by darkness would have to be collected. It was risky, but no worse than the fate they faced otherwise. They decided this was their only hope for freedom. With newfound purpose and fear coursing through their veins, they began planning. They resolved to go back to the cemetery at midnight, when the veil between the worlds grew thin. The group gathered personal items, even the tiniest belongings that held meaning. An old toy, a watch, and a ring. They believed they could reach out, make a connection to those lost, and bring back their spirits from the abyss. As the clock struck 12, they returned to their forgotten place of dread, armed with anxious hearts and binding resolve. The cemetery felt different, almost alive with anticipation. The air was thick, weighed down by the unseen spirits thrumming with energy. It felt as if the cemetery had been waiting for them. They found the spot where Thomas had fallen, the ground still disturbed. Shadows drifted close, watching intently. Ignoring the fear prickling at their skin, they knelt, laying their belongings around in a circle, forming a makeshift altar under the moonlight. Each item was a reminder of the lives lost, a plea for help from the other side. Gathering their courage, they began to chant the words from the book, voices trembling and echoing in the air. We call upon the spirits. We seek not to harm, but to help. The wind howled, and it felt as if the darkness recoiled momentarily. With each repetition, they felt something shift. Dark figures began to emerge, swirling around the ceremony. They were not just shadows anymore. They were faces, familiar and twisted with pain. Thomas stood before them, his once hollow eyes now gleaming with an inextinguishable desperation. Volatile emotions surged in their throats as horror washed over them. "Help us," he cried, reaching out, but the shadows clawed at him, pulling him back into the cold embrace of the grave. "Not again," someone shouted, tears streaming down their cheeks. The darkness was powerful, and they were starting to feel the pull as the air crackled with an intensity that weighed down heavily. Raising their voices higher, they demanded the darkness release Thomas and their lost friends. The shadows hissed, their voices screaming louder, drowning the chants with chaotic rage. "You belong to us," they howled, and the ground rumbled menacingly, sending fragments of dirt flying. With renewed determination, they pressed on, chanting with all their might, desperately wanting to reach the spirits clawing for their freedom. They pictured each familiar face, recalling memories that shone bright with life. "You are not forgotten," one shouted, and the others echoed the sentiments fervently. The shadows surged, crashing against the chanting, and the darkness writhed in response, a living mass against their fragile unity. Each syllable seemed to solidify their bond, pushing back against the chilling tide. It was a fight of wills. The shadows twisted and coiled around the forms of their friends, and the pressure in the air intensified, thick with dread. Then, with a bone-chilling crack, the ground beneath them splintered. A dark fissure appeared, yawning wide like a mouth ready to swallow them whole. They staggered back, the earth beneath their feet trembling as though it too was alive, angry at their defiance. An eerie glow flickered from the depths, illuminating the faces of the shadows that sneered up at them with twisted grins. The wind howled louder now, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the lost voices of the past. "Join us," it whispered, seductive and menacing. "You cannot fight what you are destined to become." The shadows were insidious and relentless, snaking closer to their feet, a thick fog of darkness wanting nothing more than to pull them into oblivion. With one last unyielding chant, something within the circle shimmered faintly. Wisps of light flickered to life, fueled by their appeals. It was a feeble spark against the encroaching darkness, but it ignited hope in their hearts. Thomas's voice rang through the chaos like an echo from a forgotten past. "I'm here," he called, desperation lacing his words. But just as quickly, the shadows surged forward, snapping at the light, trying to tear apart the fragile connection. The light pulsed and flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows on the grave markers, stretching and contracting with a life of their own. The horrifying reality hit. These figures were not just shadows, but representations of lost souls desperately clawing to escape. Amidst the chaos, the group felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal when they caught glimpses of their own faces merging with those twisted shadows. It was as if the darkness knew their fears, their regrets, and started morphing them into grotesque caricatures of themselves. It was a cruel joke to see every ounce of hope drained from their reflections, replaced by despair. "Hold on," someone yelled, gripping the hands of those beside them tightly. The warmth of their connection felt like a lifeline. They began to chant again, voices rising in a crescendo of hope, shaking off the chilling grip of impending doom. "We will not falter. We will not give in." The ground trembled again, and the shadows shrieked, each cry filled with rage and hunger. Then, in the midst of their pleading, they caught a glimpse of something lying at the edge of the fissure. A small, weathered box protruded from the darkness, almost glowing in defiance. "What is that?" one whispered, their voice barely breaking the panicked noise around them. A feeling of dread settled in as they approached it, drawn by an unseen force, as if the item held the power to either save or doom them. With trembling hands, they pulled it closer, the heaviness of their fear palpable in the air. The box creaked open, revealing photographs, letters, and trinkets that shimmered in the dim light rising from the depths. Each item held whispers of memories long lost, joyful laughter, shared secrets, and sorrows that bound them together in life. But as they sifted through the contents, shadows lunged, wrapping around them with icy tendrils, desperate to reclaim what they had lost. A desperate scream erupted from the group as they felt the weight of every soul they had lost dragging them down. Faces they thought they'd forgotten emerged from the flickering light, calling, pleading for release. "Let us go," they cried, but the shadows closed in tighter, until it felt as if the air had disappeared. Fighting against the darkness became a matter of survival. They all began to frantically push the box into the circle, the flickering light intensifying as the items inside cascaded out, creating a barrier against the shadows. But the stillness in the air twisted with anticipation, and an uneasy understanding began to dawn. The shadows chittered and laughed, their voices an orchestra of sorrowful wails. "You think you can keep us at bay?" they mocked. "You have no idea what you are up against." With every chant, the ground quaked violently, eager to swallow them whole. They struggled to keep their focus, voices wavering under the weight of despair. The fragments of light flickered weakly, still struggling against the encroaching mass. "We're losing it," one shouted, panic rising as they felt the darkness surge forward, seeking to claim them completely. Then, with a blinding flash, the photos and letters ignited in flames, spiraling upwards into the dark sky. They illuminated the cemetery in ghostly light, casting eerie, dancing shadows across the stones etched with names long forgotten. The air crackled with energy, each figure writhing in torment as the light banished them momentarily. However, the light only seemed to anger the shadows, who began to swirl aggressively. They morphed akin to storm clouds, dark and furious. The winds picked up, lashing at their faces, carrying whispers of the lost that threatened to drown out their defiant chants. Then the voices turned shrill, each scream piercing through like glass shattering under pressure. "You will join," they roared. From the depths of the darkness, claw-like hands shot out, grasping at whatever they could reach, determined to drag them into the abyss. The group realized it was now or never. They had to trust the box, the connection it held to those they cherished. Even in death, "We will remember you," they shouted, pouring every ounce of emotion into their words. "You will not be forgotten." The flame-sparked items began to glow brighter, transforming the shadows into fleeting glimpses of sorrowful faces, reminding them of their true humanity. As if fueled by their determination, the light surged, vengeful and bright. The shadows screeched in fury, writhing against the radiance, their forms twisting with agony. Thomas stood among them, his figure wavering as he reached out. "Don't give in," he called, the flicker of hope illuminating the fear in his eyes. Then, in a sudden burst of strength, they combined their voices into one solid cry, words echoing through the cemetery, resonating deep within the core of the darkness. Suddenly, chasms opened in the earth, revealing the tortured souls trapped within. The entire world seemed to hold its breath as terror gripped them, and everything went still for a moment. A blinding light erupted from the box, flooding the cemetery with a radiant glow. The dark winds howled like a wounded animal, swirling violently before collapsing in on themselves. Then, silence fell heavy over the graveyard, wrapping around them like a shroud, leaving only the trembling sighs of the wind. The box rested in the center, glowing softly now. They felt a stirring of unease. The shadows had not vanished completely. Instead, they lingered in the corners of their vision, watching, waiting. The air grew oppressive as if the cemetery absorbed their essence, hungry for more souls to claim. With each heartbeat, they could sense the weight of each lost soul. Thomas's presence was now nothing more than an echo, a reminder of their victory, but also their haunting defeat. They had survived the night, but as they left, they knew the battle wasn't over. The shadows still whispered, still beckoned, and as the chilling dawn broke, a new fear settled in. "Oh God," one murmured, looking back at the cemetery, where the shadows seemed to recoil but not retreat. "They're still there." A sickening realization gripped them. They had escaped this time, but the shadows would be waiting. The cemetery was no longer just a resting ground, but a battleground, and they felt the inevitable pull, an invitation to return. In the days that followed, they struggled to regain some semblance of normalcy, but the shadows lingered. Dreams became nightmares, filled with faces they thought they'd left behind. The darkness crawled into their thoughts, a nagging whisper that refused to let go. They had disrupted something ancient, and the cemetery's pulse had quickened in response. It seemed as though Thomas had simply transitioned from life to a haunting memory. They felt him everywhere they went, the glimpse of him reflected in every shadow, the echo of his voice mimicking their fears. Each night, the tales they spun around the campfire turned into darker implorations to stay away from the cemetery. "It's cursed," families warned. Yet, somehow, the group was drawn back, unable to resist the allure of the darkness. Their hearts ached with the connection they felt, a lure far too powerful to ignore. They began meeting secretly, plotting how to confront the shadows once more, as if they were drawn together by threads of despair. It wasn't long before the terrible truth came crashing down. A new phase of the darkness had begun. They could feel it in the air, creeping closer, a chilling foreboding that chilled them to the bone. And one fateful night, as they gathered there in the cemetery, the shadows around them danced wildly, mocking their presence, ready to welcome them into their sinister embrace. Now, more than ever, they knew it was time to confront the darkness. The air grew still, as if the very essence of the cemetery held its breath. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, darting between the tombstones. Like skittish animals, silently watching, they felt the temperature drop, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their bones. It was more than just fear. It was the sensation of being hunted. "Did you hear that?" whispered Clara, her voice barely more than a breath against the oppressive silence. They exchanged uneasy glances, the companionship they once held turning into a shared dread. Every rustle in the dry leaves sent shivers racing down their spines. The cemetery felt alive, twisting with anger and sorrow, thick with the weight of the souls entwined within it. Suddenly, the ground shuddered, sending a ripple through the air. Stones cracked underfoot, echoing like distant thunder, and the graves seemed to pulsate as if they held something waiting to be released. The whispers grew louder, calling to them in low, seductive tones, each word wrapped in malice. "Join us, join us!" Thomas's face swam in front of them, his smile a mask for something dark lurking beneath. It was a reminder of their last encounter, of the radiant glow that had once surrounded him. Now, faint memories twisted into nightmarish visions, leaving them trembling. "He's still here," murmured Jake, fear quaking in his voice. "He hasn't left us?" As if summoned by the thought, the shadows thickened, swirling closer like a predatory fog intent on ensnaring them. "Stay together," Clara urged, desperately gripping their hands, feeling the warmth slip away as an icy breath brushed past. They gathered into a tight cluster, forming a fragile circle of courage while the shadows pressed in tighter, pushing against their resolve. "Why do we come back?" Lisa asked, panic rising in her throat. "We should have listened." But it was too late. The energy surrounding them shifted, heavier with each heartbeat. They could almost taste the dread, thick like tar and acrid in their lungs. The box lay at their feet, glowing softly amidst the gnashing shadows. Despite the growing terror, they felt inexplicably drawn to it, as if it were a living thing calling out to them. Amidst the chaos, Clara knelt and reached toward it, trembling fingers hovering over the contents. As she touched a photograph, a jolt of electricity shot through her, and in that instant, the cemetery erupted into a cacophony of screams and wails that tore through the night. The shadows howled with fury, baring fangs like snarling beasts. The memories within the box swirled violently, tumbling around them like leaves in a storm, each image flickering between the past and the present. They saw lost loved ones, faces marred with anguish and desire, grasping at the edge of their consciousness, begging for release while the unfamiliar shadows twisted them into grotesque versions of themselves. Thunder rumbled out of nowhere, and arcs of electric blue light struck through the swirling darkness, momentarily separating the shadows, revealing tortured figures caught between the realms of the living and the dead. "Look!" Lisa gasped as the ghostly form of Thomas emerged, his face pale and twisted, eyes devoid of light. "It's him!" But it wasn't the Thomas they remembered. The warmth and laughter replaced by an empty stare that darkened further with each passing moment. He reached outward, hands grotesquely clawed, as the shadows around him writhed in delight. "Help me!" he croaked, voice barely recognizable, as if it were being ripped from his throat. Clara gasped and stepped back, horror flooding her senses. "We have to stay strong," she yelled, trying to rally the group. "We can't let them take us." But doubt gnawed at her heart as Thomas's shadowed form contorted, beckoning them closer with agonizing heat. "It's so cold here," he whispered, a shiver of disbelief breaking through her conviction. "Please end this." The shadows surged forward, extending like oily tendrils, eager to ensnare them. Lisa screamed, panic igniting into pure terror as one shadow shot directly at her, grasping her wrist with icy fingers. It felt as if the warmth of her own pulse was being drained away the moment it wrapped around her. "Let her go!" Jake shouted, yanking Lisa back, but the shadows clung tighter, thriving on fear as their inky forms expanded, swallowing her screams whole. Clara's heart raced, and she felt the pull of despair creeping into her throat. "We can't lose anyone else," she cried, desperately focusing on the box, its glow now throbbing in sync with their heartbeats. "We need to find a way to break this." The wind howled again, the shadows roared, and the cemetery itself seemed to shake with fury as if caught in a storm between two realms. "Accept your fate," the voices hissed, blending harmoniously with the wind, a heartbreaking melody laced with malice. "Join us in the darkness." With a surge of courage, Clara ripped the lid off the box. As she did, memories surged through her veins, vivid flashes of warmth and love, mingled with moments of loss. Strength braided itself within, illuminating a path forward. She shouted, "Remember who you are!" And as if hearing her, the once silent spirits staggered forward, their faces lighting up with determination. They chanted alongside Clara, voices intertwining in a desperate plea, forming a barrier against the encroaching night. The shadows hissed, shrieking in pain as the box erupted in blinding light, illuminating the cemetery in a ghostly glow. As the light swept over them, the shadows recoiled, shriveling away into whispers. But as they held fast, Clara could feel the weight of darkness pressing against her mind, fraying the edges of her resolve. She glimpsed what lay beyond their circle, a gaping void that beckoned, promising peace but hinting at something worse, something consuming. They were losing the grip on reality. Faces began to blur, shifting between the living and the shadows, lost in a morass of torment. Clara felt tendrils of despair curl around her throat, tightening with each beat of her heart. "Hold on," she cried, breath hitching in her throat, forcing herself to focus on each friend's face, grounding herself in their shared resolve. The connection was all that mattered now. "We can't let it win." But the shadows laughed, a sound twisted and hollow, as if mocking their bravery. "You cannot escape," they taunted. "This is your home now." Then, suddenly it happened. A figure materialized in the depths of the darkness, a solid silhouette rising from the abyss. It was Thomas again, but this time his appearance was different. The shadows wrapped around him like a cloak, gruesome and powerful, his expressions void of anything recognizable. "Help me," echoed again, but this time there was an undertone of cruelty, promising something worse than they could fathom. With lifeless eyes now alight, he stepped forward, a predator in a world of prey. They could feel the edges of their sanity snapping, the tension twisting into a frenzied whirlwind of fear as he lunged. "Don't look at him," Clara shouted, clutching her friends tightly, desperately shaking off the urge to submit. But the shadows had woven themselves into a tapestry of despair, creeping into every crack and crevice of their minds. Fear radiated, causing them to falter as Thomas's laughter melded with the growing dread. "What have you done?" he howled, twisted visage glaring at them, and the ground quaked beneath their feet, the world around them fracturing. "You've unleashed a terror you cannot contain." In that moment of realization, the darkness hissed, a chorus of tortured souls spiraling around them, spinning their very essence away, clawing for control. Clara shut her eyes tightly, focusing on the memories woven within the box. They held the hope and connection of every person they lost. She could feel the pulse of warmth against the shadows gripping her heart, and she shouted into the maelstrom, "Together, we can defeat this." The shadows surged, determined to consume them, but with every declaration of unity, with every word of connection that ricocheted through the air, the light burst forth even brighter. The box started to vibrate, sending shockwaves of energy spiraling through them, illuminating the cemetery in an ethereal glow. And as the fate of the living and the dead hung in the balance, they realized it wasn't just a battle against the shadows. It was a fight for their very souls. With a final push, Clara and her friends united, their voices intertwining in a crescendo of defiance. But even as the shadows writhed and twisted, they knew that this wasn't the end. The darkness was relentless, forever lurking, and as dawn broke over the horizon, a chilling certainty crept in. The battle had only just begun, and the cemetery would always be waiting for them to return. As the light from the box illuminated the graveyard, shadows recoiled, only to regroup, swirling angrily like smoke in a windless room. The air grew heavier, thick with a sense of dread, the kind that clung to the skin and seeped into the very marrow of their bones. Clara's heart raced as she scanned the horizon for any sign of safety. The cemetery that had once seemed merely haunted now felt alive and pulsating, almost hungry for their fear, for their souls. "Something's not right," Clara whispered, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Thomas's twisted grin lurking behind her. But instead, the shapes moved farther away, a dark mass cannonading against the ephemeral glow of the box, as if waging a war unseen. With a jarring crack, a headstone nearby shattered. The sound echoed in the night like gunfire, sending shards of stone flying. Behind it, a figure clawed its way to the surface, a pale hand breaking through the earth. It grasped at the air, dirt raining down around it, revealing a gaunt face, distorted yet familiar. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Is that?" But no one answered, all eyes fixated on the emerging horror. A woman, once known to them, now nothing but a wretched specter, dragged herself into the open. Her hair hung in strings, matted and dark, eyes wide and screaming with an emptiness that sent chills racing down their spines. "Help me," her voice cracked, slipping through lips that had become brittle with decay. "I'm trapped." The shadows ebbed closer, hungry for her anguish, snaking around her feet, lapping at her despair as she struggled against them, tripping over fragile stones. The whispers grew louder, discordant and angry, piercing the night with desperation. "Look away! Don't listen!" Jake shouted, but the words barely penetrated the haze of horror wrapping around them. Clara felt her own footing tremble, her heart tumbling into uncertainty. Closing her eyes briefly, Clara forced herself to take a step forward. "We can save you," she cried, voice ringing with a false bravado. "Don't!" Lisa hissed, yanking Clara back. It could be a trap, but the woman's eyes bored deep into Clara's soul, flickering with a glimmer of hope. "Please," she gasped, the shadows tightening around her with a furious hiss. "Help me break free." Fear twisted the air, weighing heavy as the restless spirits beckoned, pulling Clara into an inner battle with morality and dread. Laughter filled the corners of the graveyard, a chorus of the damned erupting into a cacophony as if mocking their every hesitation. Terror surged anew, a visceral tide that roared against the confines of the box, threatening to extinguish the fragile light. Shadows coiled around Clara's feet, dragging at her very will to resist. She felt whispers in her mind, seductive and dark. "Let go," they murmured, like a haunting lullaby. "Join us?" But Clara opened her eyes, the warmth of her friends anchoring her. She shook her head, barely able to articulate her thoughts. "We're not doing this. Not again." In the distance, a sudden crash rang out, reverberating through the graveyard. The ground trembled violently, and without warning, the tombstones began to sway. Clara stumbled back, catching herself just before her legs gave way beneath her. "Run!" Jake shouted, fear etched across his features. The earth cracked open, fissures sprawling out like the claws of some slumbering titan freshly awakened. The shadows pulsated in a wild frenzy, exultant amidst the chaos. The woman screamed, her voice piercing through the night as the darkness enveloped her. "No!" Clara cried, desperation clawing at her chest. But as she lunged forward, the shadows pulled her back, their insidious grip constricting like a serpent's coil. Just then, the figures began to rise, thrumming from their graves, lost souls of the cemetery shaking off the shackles of the earth. Clara's heart raced as faces she recognized, friends and family long gone, staggered forward, eyes vacant and limbs stiff, driven by an unseen force lurking in the dark. "Clara," called a voice tinged with sorrow, echoing from the creeping shadows. It was her mother, the light of her life, now a grotesque caricature, steps halting and unsteady. "Help me, my child." "No, it can't be." Clara screamed, collapsing to her knees, her heart breaking. The shadows writhed around her like a wall of despair, each whisper laced with venom, each laugh striking against her resolve. Memories flooded her mind, twisting into nightmares. "Embrace the darkness," they hissed, circling closer, inching toward her with sinister glee. "It offers relief." Lisa pulled at Clara's arm, her voice panic-stricken. "We can't lose you. Stand firm." But Clara felt the darkness tugging at her mind, beginning to drown her hope in a tide of hopelessness. Suddenly, her thoughts trailed back to the flickering light of the box, now pulsating violently. It felt like a lifeline, a memory of warmth and comfort amidst the chilling void closing around them. Together, Clara finally shouted, fighting back against the shadows. "We can't let them win." With that, she clasped hands with Jake and Lisa, forming a protective circle. They focused every ounce of their energy, bringing forth the memories of joy and laughter shared, of love that transcends shadows. Gradually, The overwhelming darkness began to shrink back, its grip loosening slightly as the connection fortified their resolve. But the malevolent spirits did not yield easily, wailing and screeching in rage as they slashed at the fabric of their unity. Clara saw Thomas again, his form indiscernible amidst the shadows, an anchor of all her fears. "Clara," he howled, voice echoing with anguish, pulling at her sanity. "You can't survive this." Through the rallying cries of her friends, Clara forced herself to meet his gaze once more, her stomach churning with anguish. "You're not him anymore. Fight it." But doubt seeped into her heart, the memories of affection now marred with tragedy. The air around them twisted, shadows lashing out like whips, slicing through the unseen thread that bound them together. The cemetery shook violently, the ground beneath unfurling like a hungry maw, eager to swallow them whole. In that instant, the sudden darkness swallowed their joining light, enveloping the three of them in a void so thick that memory abandoned them. Clara felt her mind being pulled apart, each fear and regret surfacing, rising like a dark tide intent on erasing her from existence. "Hey!" Booming voice echoed from the abyss. "You will not escape your burdens. All that you have lost belongs to me now." But amidst the chaos, something within Clara ignited, a flicker of defiance like a firefly struggling against the dark. "We've lost enough," she shouted, clutching her friends tighter. As they braced for impact, Clara could feel warmth pulse from within her as she grasped at the fleeting memories of laughter that danced just beyond her grasp. "Remember us," they cried as the shadows lunged once more, fierce and relentless. And in that moment, the flicker inside her erupted into a blazing inferno, flooding the cemetery with the brilliant light of love and solidarity, pushing back against the encroaching darkness, a shield against despair. Yet, the shadows would not bend easily. The figures of her past twisted and writhed, their faces morphing into hideous visages as they scrambled to break free from the grip of light. "Join us! You belong to us now," they screeched, voices melded into a cacophony of sorrow. With embers of resolve still crackling in her heart, Clara summoned every ounce of strength, shouting into the ravaging storm. "Not today! We break free!" Landslide whispers erupted into manic howls, shaking up the earth as they lifted, swirling in a cyclone of despair that threatened to consume everyone standing. Each heartbeat echoed painfully as Clara struggled against both the overwhelming pressure of the darkness and the phantom faces that leered back at her. She clenched her fists, every memory boiling in her chest. Friends lost, laughter shared, love unwavering. Then, in the eye of that storm, she felt a growing rhythm, a heartbeat that synchronized with her own, a reminder that they were not alone, that they never had been. With a fierce determination, Clara formed a cone of purity, the light of love battling against the insatiable shadow. Together, she cried one last time, calling the souls of her friends, invoking their shared stories, their dedication to each other, like a well of ancient power boiling just beneath the surface. The ground shook violently as the shadows lunged, clawing at her skin, jagged spurs of sorrow merging with the encroaching tide of darkness. Clara stood firm, refusing to let go, pulling the weight of their shared existence forward against the tide. With one final burst, the pure light exploded outward, illuminating the cemetery with an ethereal glow. The shadows screeched in agony as the connection ignited, ripping apart the veil that kept them bound in torment. But just as victory seemed within reach, something shifted. From the depths of the earth, a low rumble, more sinister than before, reverberated through the very core of the cemetery. The ground twisted grotesquely, fissures erupting and tearing the night sky apart, separating them in an instant. Clara, she heard their screams, echoing through the air as shadows surged, rekindling their endgame with ferocity. And even as light surged around her like an unending tide, Clara realized nothing was truly finished. The darkness had merely retreated, drawing back into the whispering depths below, a promise of return lingering heavily in the air. As the shadows slinked away, Clara fell to her knees, heart pounding against her ribs. And for a fleeting moment amid the chaos, silence enveloped her. But as it dawned, she understood. This was just the beginning. As the last of the light flickered and faded away, she felt an unsettling weight settle around her heart, a chilling awareness that sent shivers cascading down her spine. The cemetery had whispered secrets, and though some had escaped, many were yet to be unearthed. In that darkness, something sinister remained, waiting, watching. And she knew, with a growing certainty, they would soon find themselves facing it again. Clara's breaths came in ragged gasps as the last flicker of warmth faded into the cool night air. The shadows curled back around her, a creeping coldness seeping into her bones. Goosebumps prickled her skin, as if they were crawling beneath the surface, gnawing through the layers of her sanity. The cemetery, once a silent sentinel, seemed to awaken with a low, rumbling groan, echoing through the disarray of cracked earth and crumbling stones. Grave markers shifted, tilting like weary sentinels straining to keep watch. The air thickened with the strong scent of damp earth and decay, overwhelming her senses and wrapping around her like a shroud of dread. "We can't stay here," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Fingers tightened around her arm, urging her away from the impending darkness that still loomed in the corners of her vision. "This isn't over," she muttered, her eyes fixated on the shadows that writhed like angry serpents, clawing their way back toward her. As she stumbled backward, a chilling wind swept through the graveyard, carrying the smell of something rotten and ancient. The leaves of the gnarled trees rustled ominously, sounding almost like whispers, words too faint to understand but impossibly urgent. Clara felt something brush against her ankle, sharp and cold like claws scraping against her skin. She gasped and looked down to find a broken chain lying amongst the weeds, rusted and twisted with age. "Did you see that?" she hissed, glancing back at her friends. But they only stared wide-eyed, frozen in horror as the ground beneath them shifted ominously. With a sudden crack, the earth opened up in the distance, and a pale, skeletal hand reached out, clawing its way to freedom. "Run!" Lisa screamed, breaking the trance that had enveloped them as fear surged within Clara's chest. But they didn't know where to run. The chill deepened, infiltrating the very air they breathed and setting their hearts racing as more hands followed. They pulled forth from the depths, gaunt figures, hollowed eyes gleaming with a tortured light. Clara could see their faces, once familiar, but now twisted with malice, eyes sunken and mouths set in grotesque grins. Every haunting visage was an echo of something they'd lost, something that lingered here. "Stay together," Jake shouted as they began to back away, unsure of the path they'd come from. The figures advanced more quickly, their footsteps silent against the damp ground, but a palpable weight filled the air, an unseen force pushing against them, urging them toward that dark, gaping maw. "They want us to join them," Clara realized, horror flooding her senses as she tore her gaze from the skeletal remains of her past. "Fight it," she yelled, struggling against the pull of despair that threatened to swallow her whole. And as if in response to her voice, the ground quivered violently once more. Waves surged beneath their feet, and the figures paused, their attention shifting momentarily to the ground. Clara felt a shudder ripple through the earth, a warning that crawled up her spine. Then, without warning, the gnarled trees overhead shook as if the very spirits of the forest were awakening from a deep slumber. Branches creaked threateningly, shadows dancing even more wildly, and the air grew charged with an electric energy, crackling like a storm gathering strength. "What is happening?" Lisa whimpered, eyes wide with fright. "It's trying to pull us back," Jake answered, his voice shaky yet firm. But Clara couldn't stand still, the shift around them galvanizing a deep, instinctual fear within her. "We have to break the binding," she shouted. "How?" repeated Jake, desperation tinging his tone. "The box," she suddenly remembered, the last flickering light of hope buried deep within her mind. It's the only way. And with the shadows advancing again, Clara took a step towards where she thought they had left the box, heart pounding louder than ever as she raced toward it. The darkness clawed at her heels, hot breath tugging at her with whispered promises of acceptance, wanting her to stay, to surrender. No, she cried, shaking her head violently, dismissing the sinister temptations. As she reached the spot where they'd found it, panic surged when she saw it was gone, crumbled into the earth like the rest of the graveyard. "Where is it?" she screamed, voice echoing in the still air. But the shadows laughed in collective mirth, a hollow sound that reverberated against the stones, feeding the darkness that surrounded them. "It was never meant for you," they taunted, fingers weaving through the air like spider silk. The figures drew nearer, reaching out, their hands brushing against her skin, causing icy shocks to erupt through her. Clara fell to her knees, despair washing over her like suffocating waves. "We will take you home," they whispered softly, the allure wrapping tighter around her heart. But somewhere deep within her, a flicker ignited, burning against their cold whispers. "You're not my home," she chanted, pushing against the weight of their sorrow, fighting against the unrelenting pull of despair. "Join us," a familiar voice called, rising above the others. It was Thomas, twisted and broken, but his eyes still held that spark of life. "Help me," he pleaded, reaching toward her, the shadows swirling around him like a cloak. But Clara shook her head, refusing to drown in the depths of that darkness. "You can fight, I know you can." His expression changed in an instant, mouth twisting into a cruel sneer as shadows flicked like sparks around him. "You will regret this," he bellowed, voice transforming in an echoing cacophony, becoming a chorus of the lost. As their anguished cries filled the chill air, an earthquake rattled through the ground, sending them sprawling onto the cold, unforgiving earth. Desperate, she looked at Jake and Lisa, their faces gaunt with fear but alive with determination, and they pushed against the weight of agony surrounding them. Together, she urged once more, their unity the last flicker of resistance. "We break free," they shouted in unison, voices rising against the tide of shadows, battling against the grasping hands that clawed at their very hearts. In that moment of unity, their light grew brighter, pulsating rhythmically, pushing back against the darkness, and it raged like an animal, thrashing against the bonds that sought to claim them. The screams of souls echoed around them, sounding almost like a storm, would-be bondages breaking beneath the force of resolve. But as they fought, the shadows twisted and contorted, morphing into something darker, more sinister. With a blinding flash, the cemetery erupted in a wave of tremors that sent shockwaves through the trio. Shadows danced back, swirling to form grotesque figures, their gaunt silhouettes morphing into nightmarish creatures that twisted in agony. "You cannot escape," they shrieked, voices layered with a harmony of anguish that entwined into a chilling symphony. Clara could feel the cold despair creeping back, threatening to drown them whole once more. "Keep fighting," Jake yelled, breaking through the clamor of despair. But the figures lunged forward, tendrils of darkness snaking out, eager to snatch them into that blissful oblivion. "Hold on," she cried, gripping her friend's hands tightly as torn pieces of reality swirled around them. Desperation surged, gathering into an all-consuming rage. The earth shook, and with every heartbeat, Clara felt the immense weight of the shadows starting to crack around their light, fracturing the dark as they pushed against the invading terror. But just as they rallied again, the ground beneath them cracked open wide, revealing the bottomless darkness below, filled with the sounds of agony and the hungry whisper of the lost. "No!" Their cries echoed in a chaotic frenzy, the flames of their bravery battling against that insidious pull. Yet it was then that a chilling realization dawned on her. This had always been a trap, crafted to ensnare them into an endless cycle of fear and despair. And with that understanding came clarity. This was not just a fight for survival, but a reckoning, deeper than her own life, tethered to every lost spirit that had roamed this ground in search of peace. We have to remember, she screamed, forcing her voice over the chaos that clawed at her hearts. What do you mean? Lisa cried back, the shadows bending toward her, threatening to swallow her whole. Their memories, Clara gasped, voice strained as time slowed around them. We have to give them a reason to fight back, she yelled, feeling the warmth of the connection still surging in the air. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, summoning every flicker of memory that tied them to this place, the laughter that echoed in the halls of life once shared. Remember the joy, remember the love, she shouted, spilling their memories into the swirling chaos around them, reaching for those lost souls. The shadows recoiled, wailing in fury as she conjured images of birth, of laughter, of cherished moments that blossomed with the vibrancy of life. You are not forgotten, she screamed, throat raw as more voices joined the chorus, flooding the earth with warmth and defiance. Join us, Jake cried, the shadows losing their grip in the wake of the rising tide of hope. One by one, lost voices began to resonate, forging chains of connection in that chaotic darkness, tearing away at hopelessness like threads unraveling a tapestry. And just as their energies surged, crackling with life and warmth, the ground convulsed again, begging to swallow them whole. But Clara felt change pulse through her, a tide of fierce determination welling up from deep within. Now, she barked, unleashing their combined force of memories into the very heart of decay. The world exploded in a tsunami of blinding light, an amalgamation of sorrow and joy that tore through the cemetery, shattering the chains of despair. As the darkness began to peel away, revealing the roots of lost souls entwined within, a howling scream erupted from the abyss, which threatened to consume everything they had fought for. And just when it seemed too late, Clara felt a tether expand, unseen yet profoundly strong, a connection to every lost spirit willing to remember. We are more than the darkness, she roared, her voice breaking through the cacophony of despair, resonating deep into the very bowels of the graveyard. With a final surge, right as the shadows began to envelop her, Clara gripped her friend's hands tighter. The tangible force of their bond ignited into a blinding flash of pure warmth, engulfing everything, scattering the shadows into the void and leaving the night echoing with a solitary silence. And in that stillness, Clara gasped for breath. The weight of all they had lost washed away as she opened her eyes to the remnants of the fallen cemetery, smoothed over by the light of dawn creeping across the horizon. Yet, deep in her heart, she knew it was only a matter of time and a promise. Darkness was always lurking, waiting for the moment they would release their guard again. The air grew heavy around them, suffocatingly still as they stood amidst the remnants of the graveyard. Where once the screams of shadows had echoed, now silence reigned, tense and unsettling. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine, as if the ground beneath her feet was still alive. Watching, waiting. We should go, Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, eyes darting nervously toward the twisting trees. But as they turned to leave, a strange rustling caught Clara's attention. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement among the graves, the shadows seemingly reforming in the pale morning light. Branches that were once still now swung gently, as if stirred by an unseen wind. Did you see that? Clara asked, heart racing. It's just the trees, Clara, Lisa replied, but uncertainty crept in her voice as she stepped closer to the group, scanning the cemetery. Yet something in the air changed. The silence thickened, and an oppressive weight began to descend once more. The distant cawing of crows echoed like a warning from above, but their calls morphed into something sinister, a cry of panic woven into their shrill notes. Clara's hands tightened into fists, fingers digging into her palms as goosebumps crawled over her skin, amplifying her unease. Let's not linger, Jake said, now glancing over his shoulder. The path seemed darker, the way ahead retreating into shadows that were daydreams of horror now surfacing. But just as they took a hesitant step forward, an unexpected chill whipped through the clearing, causing the trees to groan lowly, unnerving echoes spilling out into the open like secrets too dangerous to share. Then it happened. A figure emerged from behind a tangle of roots. Its silhouette slumped, features shrouded in murky fog, and an eerie light seemed to shimmer off its hollowed bones. Time halted, breath catching in their throats as the enchanting dance of shadows drew closer to reveal a ghastly visage, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. "What the hell is that?" Clara gasped, every heartbeat pounding like a tribal drum in her chest. "Run!" Lisa shouted, but it felt as though they were rooted to the ground, frozen under the weight of an unseen force. The figure's eyes flickered, pinpricks of darkness that scorched the air between them, swirling like smoke and beckoning them into the depths of dread. "We have to leave," Jake echoed, finally breaking their trance and yanking Clara's arm. They bolted, scrambling down the path. Yet the shadows seemed to pulse around them like a living entity, chasing, reaching. And underneath their frantic footsteps, the earth trembled again, cracks snaking through muddy ground, echoing like hideous laughter that sent shivers racing down Clara's spine. Shadows converged and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that mirrored every one of their fears. From the corners of her vision, she caught flashes, faces twisted in torment, clawing at the air, mouths opening wide in agony. They were the lost, pleading for a chance to escape the darkness. "They're not real," she yelled, fighting against the suffocating sensation that threatened to overwhelm her. Focus on the light," Jake insisted, pulling her forward. Yet when Clara looked back, the figures had multiplied, a rising tide of despair that engulfed every inch of her consciousness. Each step deeper into the woods felt like an invitation, a cruel taunt buried in the whispers of wind as tendrils of darkness wrapped tightly around their legs, pulling them back toward the graveyard. "Keep running," Lisa urged, tears glistening, fear etched into her every feature. And just as they reached the tree lean, something jolted from the shadows. A hand, skeletal and pale, reaching out from the ground, desperately grasping for them. The sight sent a cold wave of dread crashing over Clara, freezing her very blood. With renewed vigor, they pushed forward, glancing back as tendrils reached for them, clawing desperately at the space they just vacated. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, memories of what they'd encountered flooding back in flashes, disorienting and eerie. "We can't keep running forever," Clara yelled, panic surging through every fiber of her being. "We don't have a choice," Jake countered, glancing back, shadows now melded into the trunks of trees, lurking, waiting. Stepping onto a narrow path, they stumbled through overgrown underbrush, a dense fog settling around them, obscuring their vision and wrapping them in heavy despair. It turned suffocating. The darkness clung and caressed, whispering secrets of the forest to torment their minds. "We're not alone, are we?" came Clara's trembling voice, nerves fraying at the edges. "Just keep moving," came Jake's strained reply. Yet even as they pressed on, the very ground beneath them seemed to breathe. A damp heaviness rose, curling around their feet like reverberating chants of lost souls. The trees whispered and mocked, shadows tightening their grip as if eager to snatch them back to the earth. Clara felt the tang of metal in the air as her heart hammered violently against her ribcage, each pulse a reminder of just how close they were to the abyss. "We have to find a way to break the cycle," she murmured, mostly to herself, the crushing realization that darkness was not finished with them. In that moment, a distant glow caught her eye, a flicker of something inviting, captivating amid the shadows. "Over there," Clara pointed, lunging toward the light, hope surging through her veins like a wildfire. With every hurried step, the shadows began to surge angrily, thrashing, twisting into shrill forms that howled and moaned like tortured banshees. They pressed on, driven by the light, but as they drew closer, the illumination warped treacherously, flickering wildly like a candle in a storm. Was it truly a sign of salvation, or another cruel deception crafted by the dark? What if it's a trap? Lisa panted, glancing back as a shadow lunged from the forest, only just missing her shoulder. "We have no other choice," Clara shouted, forcing her feet to quicken their pace despite the uncertain pull of fear. The glow shimmered larger, distorting into a swirling vortex that beckoned them forward, alive with whispers promising sanctuary, solace in the tumult. Clara's skin prickled as they neared, caught in the magnetic draw of that haunting light, entangled in wicked allure. Then, just yards away, a deafening roar erupted, an encroaching wave of darkness collapsing around them, wrapping tighter, swallowing the light whole. The cacophony of torment surged, leaving them on the edge of despair, caught in a web woven from haunting secrets buried deep in their very souls. "Run!" Clara screamed, as a flood of shadows surged toward them, threatening to consume the last flickering glimmer of hope. They stumbled over roots that twisted like fingers grabbing at their ankles, each step echoing with the sound of their frantic heartbeats. The dark was relentless, clawing for them, and every ounce of fear pulsed in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara could feel the breath of some unseen force just behind them, hot and rancid, making her skin crawl. Jake sprinted ahead, guiding them through the trees, but the path became a winding maze. Branches swayed threateningly as if trying to guide them deeper into the darkness. "This way," he yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the murmur of the gnarled trees, whispering secrets only the shadows could understand. Fear clenched at Clara's chest, the way back disappearing behind a growing wall of black. Each time she glanced back, the figures loomed closer, distorted faces twisted in pure agony, mouths opening and closing as if they were calling her name, begging for release into the living world. "Don't look," she wanted to shout, but the words stuck in her throat like ash. They barreled forward, breath ragged, lungs screaming for air, minds racing to make sense of the nightmare enveloping them. After what felt like hours of running in circles, Clara finally caught sight of a clearing bathed in a weak, tentative light. Over there, she pointed wildly, hope intertwining with dread, the path ahead narrowing in on a beacon that twisted and flickered like a candle in a storm. They raced toward it, slipping through the underbrush, but as they entered the clearing, their hearts sank. The light was emerging from an ancient stone well, dark and foreboding, its edges crooked and crumbling. The flicker danced above the surface, teasing them, beckoning them to come closer, but a sickening dread crawled into Clara's stomach like a serpent. "What if it's a trap?" Jake panted, backing away as he scanned the perimeter, eyes darting back to the encroaching figures that closed in around them. "We don't have time to think. It's our only chance," Clara retorted, her own fear bubbling up thickly, drowning reason in a tide of panic. As they looked at one another, a silence fell, thick and heavy, filled only by the distant cries of the damned, echoing through the haunted woods. The shadows twisted, restless, and the sensation that they were surrounded sunk into their bones, teeth gnashing, breath coming short and shallow as the figures began to coalesce into recognizable forms. Faces from the past, twisted into masks of sorrow, staring with hollow eyes full of despair. "No, no," Clara choked out, her heart plummeting. She felt a pull, an urgency, a need to confront the darkness that taunted them from the well's depths, the light growing stronger now, its enchanting glow whispering promises of freedom from their torment. "If we don't jump, they'll take us," she cried, eyes wide with terror. She felt a part of her wanting to relent, to give in. Lisa stepped forward, drawn to the light like a moth to flame, but Clara grabbed her arm, adrenaline fueling her urgency. "Don't," she hissed as the figures lunged forward, faces contorted in anguish, hands stretching out in desperate pleas, shadowy fingers grazing skin with icy whispers of dread. The air grew cold, a biting chill unlike anything they had ever known, seeping into their bones, crawling through their veins. I can't let go," Lisa sobbed, voice shaky. Every instinct screamed at Clara to leap into the abyss, to lose herself in the promises that glowed before her. Yet something inside her fought back, voices of reason telling her to resist. "We have to face it. We have to face our fears," she shouted, tilting her head back to the swirling shadows. As the darkness surrounded them, it felt like the earth itself twisted beneath their feet, an off-kilter mockery of safety, the world they once knew crumbling as the well pulsated with darkness wrapped in light. Clara and Jake locked eyes, resolve swaying between them, the shadows inches away, their cold breaths a consuming wave threatening to pull them under. "On three," Jake whispered. "We leap into the light." Clara nodded, gripping Lisa's hand tightly. "Don't look back. 1, 2, 3. They jumped, and the world exploded into a cacophony of swirling lights and phantom screams that clawed at their sanity. The impact was jarring, as if they'd been pulled into a storm, the shadows howling around them. But the light formed a cocoon, warding off the encroaching darkness. Instead of freedom, however, they landed in a surreal landscape, an endless expanse of fog, swirling and wrapping around them like a shroud. The ground felt soft beneath their feet, and the whispers faded into a chilling silence, yet the pressure remained. It was cold, too cold, and a heavy weight settled on their shoulders, a lingering strain of dread and uncertainty. "What? Where are we?" Clara whispered, glancing around in panic. The reality was disjointed, a flat void against which the shadows remained eerily vibrant. Shades of the lost were compared to dark whispers, circling round and returning to feed on their deepest fears. "There's no escaping it," Jake muttered, voice echoing eerily. "It's just gone into hiding." As if to punctuate his words, a low rumble resonated beneath them, shaking the ground, and the fog stirred violently, swirling to reveal ghostly figures creeping toward them once more. The sight sent a wave of terror crashing over Clara, a realization clawing its way to the surface. They hadn't escaped at all. They had only shifted to another part of the nightmare. The faces of the lost were clearer now, their pain palpable, and the haunting guttural sounds echoed in the air, looping the same tormenting refrain. "Stay, stay, stay. We need to find a way out," Clara urged, stepping back, but the fog thickened, obscuring any path forward, cocooning them in layers of regret. Then faintly, there was a sound, an echo of laughter, twisted and cruel, threading through the shadows that loomed closer. "You can't run from what you are," a voice echoed, chilling her to the bone. It was unmistakably familiar, twisting around her heart like a vice, dredging up memories better left buried, fear scratching at her consciousness. "Is that," she began, scanning the drifting shadows, emotions clashing and colliding within her. The figures moved, undulating, their forms shifting until one emerged with a face she could scarcely recognize. One of her own from days long past, twisted in a malevolent grin. "You belong to us," it rasped, its laughter shrill, a cacophony that echoed against the silence. Clara staggered back, breathing heavily, panic flooding her vision as she remembered the promise of dawn. Yet there was only darkness here. "No, we will not become like you," she yelled, but every sound felt like a thrown pebble into an ocean of dread, swallowed whole before making impact. Join us," the crowd of figures chimed in unison, tilting their heads as if waiting for a response, shadows manipulating, swirling in a chaotic dance of despair around the well's edge. The laughter echoed, a haunting reminder that they had merely crossed a threshold into something far more sinister. "We must face this," Clara cried out, eyes narrowing against the haze. She didn't know what this was or how to confront the shadows, but amidst the cacophony, she felt a flicker of resolve begin to surge. "We will not surrender," she proclaimed, stepping forward, ready to confront her past, a desperate hope igniting within. With each step, the shadows recoiled, their laughter fading into a low simmer, surprise gripping the air as a surge of light began to emanate from Clara's core. "I choose to remember," Clara shouted, her voice cutting through the darkness. "I choose to heal." And as she embraced that choice, the faces twisted, shrieking in rage and disbelief. Shadows rattled and slithered, chaos clashing with the clarity of her intention. The very ground trembled beneath her as she held the light close, willing it to push back against the encroaching darkness. "Together," she shouted, looking at Jake and Lisa with fierce determination. Possibility ignited like a spark. They stepped in a line beside her, hearts pounding as they pooled their strength, light intertwining into a web of hope strong enough to pierce the deepest shadows looming around them. The darkness pulsated angrily, swirling against the light, casting an ominous silhouette that felt like it was watching, waiting. Then, just beyond their reach, Clara felt a tremor, an echo of the past that was neither lost nor gone entirely. It was a weary acceptance, the chance of redemption still flickering like the dawn, so close yet so far. "Ready," she whispered, and as one, they leaned into the light, facing the darkness head-on, believing that perhaps they could reclaim not only their freedom, but also their very souls. But just as they surged forward, the darkness howled, the shadows coiling tighter, pulling them into a depth so immense and unfathomable that clarity began to blur once more. "No! Stay with me," Clara cried, her heart pounding against the encroaching void. As her voice echoed into the abyss, she could feel the darkness pulling, wrapping around her like a shroud, clutching at her resolve. The world spun wildly, clarity fading as panic surged back, the faces emerging from ice-nipped dark flashing before her eyes with an ominous dread. Clara felt herself slipping, slowly losing grip on the warmth of light, fear creeping into the edges of her vision as shadows danced with devastating intent, ready to envelop them completely. And amid that chaos, she seized the last threads of hope, to resist remembering. "We are not lost," she screamed, filled with desperation and defiance. "We hold the memories, the love." With a final surge of will, she wielded the light like a weapon, its glow growing brighter, the tendrils of darkness recoiling under its intensity. But just as the shadows began to dissolve, warping and curling away, something unknowable stirred in the depth of the dark, eyes shimmering like abyssal stars. The feeling of dread escalated, coiling tightly around them as a chilling laughter erupted, deep and resonant, a sound that felt ancient, hungry. Clara realized with a jolt that they weren't alone. Something lurked deeper, something that had been waiting for them, its presence like a storm brewing just below the surface, hunger crackling in the air. With dread crawling in the pit of her stomach, she turned to her friends, fear palpable in the quiver of her voice. "We have to be ready," she said hastily. "This is just the beginning." But as they steeled themselves, the dark titans advanced, slithering closer, shadows shifting, laughter growing louder, a promise of terror that tore at the seams of hope they had fought to create. They braced for impact, knowing with a sinking inevitability that the fight was far from over. And as the light flickered against the abyss, Clara could finally hear them, the voices whispering from the past, echoing through the depths. You cannot escape what lies within. Her heart thundered in her chest. The air thickened around them as shadows swirled like smoke, coiling around her legs, tugging insistently. They twisted and writhed with an uncanny intelligence, as if each one held secrets of their lives, their deepest fears. The ground beneath their feet felt alive, pulsating like a heartbeat, like it had its own desires, drawing them into an embrace that felt suffocating and wrong. Just ahead, a flicker of movement caught Clara's eye, a figure lurching forward from the depths, half-formed and grotesque, its features obscured by the misty darkness. She felt all breath leave her lungs as it let out a hollow, rasping laugh. It was a sound that sent chills spiraling down her spine, reverberating in her bones. "You're too late to escape," it sneered, the voice dripping with mocking glee, sending jagged shards of ice into her veins. The shadows quivered in response, as if fueled by the raw energy of its words. "Join us," it continued, the figure stepping forward, revealing a face that resembled a warped reflection of Clara herself, eyes dark pits of emptiness and despair. "Your past is here, waiting." The ground trembled once more, echoing the tortured cries of souls trapped within the shadows, their lamentations blending into a cacophony of swirling dread, weaving a tapestry of nightmares as they reached out from the edges of the void. Lisa gasped, stumbling back, her breaths quickening, a fragile light of hope fading from her eyes. "What do we do?" "They'll take us," she cried, horror branding her words heavy. Clara fought to clear her mind, but panic tightened its grip. She felt that familiar darkness creeping into her thoughts, whispering sweet, poisonous lies. "We stick together," she yelled, her voice trembling yet resolute, scanning the lunging shadows, desperate for a flicker of the friend she knew would fight alongside her. Jake gripped her shoulder tightly, fear etched on his face. "But how? It's too strong, Clara. Believe," she shouted back, her voice breaking against the weight of the shadows that continued to morph and shift, threatening to engulf them as the air thickened with dread. In that moment, an otherworldly growl erupted, shaking the ground as enormous shadows rose taller, merging into a monstrous entity that towered above them, blocking out the faint light that pushed against the edges. Its elongated arms stretched wider, dark tendrils flicking out like striking vipers, each one a manifestation of their past fears, memories twisted into forms designed to elicit terror. "You can't hide from it," the figure hissed, and the shadows behind it echoed the sentiment in a haunting chorus, their voices slithering through the air like a sinister melody. "You're part of this." The realization hit Clara like a bolt of lightning, making her heart race. They weren't merely fighting against the darkness. They were battling their own pain, their own monsters. Something primal within her ignited, fueled by rage and determination. She couldn't let the shadows reclaim them. But as the monster lunged, its maw stretching impossibly wide, she felt a deep, gnawing fear prick at her resolve. The faces of the lost began to scream, echoing the anguish of those who had succumbed to despair, drowning out her thoughts, overcoming her senses as she felt the cold creeping back in. "Remember," she called out desperately, "we've faced worse. We can break this." The creature paused, its breath hot against her skin, freezing her in place as visions of her darkest moments flashed before her. The sting of betrayal, the weight of loss, the tangled roots of regret that anchored her here. The shadows writhed, and she could feel their icy grip tightening, pulling her closer to the chilling depths, her past unraveling before her like the pages of a forgotten book. "No," she cried out, her voice bitter, filled with defiance and desperation. But already doubts began to claw at her mind. What if they were right? What if she truly didn't have the strength to escape this abyss? Doubt clawed at the edges of her thoughts as the entity inched closer, its face shifting into a lover, a friend, a figure from her past washed away by tears and forgotten dreams, all woven into the darkness. "You belong with us, Clara," it cooed, the voice a warped echo of something she once knew, a sinister invitation wrapped in the fragile ties of affection. Her heart began to race in a panic she couldn't shake. "Fight it," the words echoed in her mind as if Jake's voice bounced off the walls of her consciousness, urging her to resist the allure of familiarity, the sullen comfort that lay within giving in. The tendrils began to lurch toward her, curling around her wrists like vines intent on constricting her movements. And in that fleeting moment, she felt as if she stood at the edge of an abyss that beckoned her, promising solace in the dark. But just as the darkness threatened to engulf her completely, she glimpsed Jake and Lisa, each battling their own shadows, the fight reflected in their eyes. She saw strength, determination. Clara clenched her teeth, realizing they needed to confront their fears head-on, to unleash the light that flickered within them. Together, she shouted, a flicker of bravery igniting in her chest. They formed a circle, hands clasped tight, three souls intertwined, channeling their strength against the weight of the shadows that loomed overhead, battling the tide. "We are the light," she declared, feeling the warmth of her friends, a massive weight lifting from her core, finding courage in their shared determination. The monster recoiled, its twisted form halting mid-stride, hesitation fluttering through its menacing countenance, flickering darkly like a flame threatened by a sudden gust of wind. The light began to swell with incandescent brilliance, illuminating the night air as they shouted their fears into existence, confronting them one by one, ripping off the masks that had covered their truths. "We will resist," Clara screamed, her voice echoing against the shadows, igniting a fire in the depths of their shared history. And as memories streamed out, a channel of light illuminated the darkness, staggering the figure, forcing it to shift and squint against the brightness. Clara felt the weight of the shadows begin to lift as clarity poured in, filling the void where fear once thrived and spreading strength like wildfire through her veins. But just as the tendrils began to vaporize into nothingness, laughter erupted, chilling and sharp, a distorted sound that folded into the air like a knife, slicing through their newfound courage. "Fools!" the creature howled, and suddenly the shadows were inescapable, swirling violently as if agitated by an unseen storm, a fierce retaliation pulsating with despair. They stumbled, the ground shifting beneath their feet, warped and unstable. The many faces twisted into contorted parodies, warping in a grotesque dance that pooled deep inside, feeding on the very light they sought to summon, weaving darkness into the threads of hope. Clara felt something tightening around her throat, an unseen force that choked her breath, a binding darkness that clawed for her very soul. Was it all for naught? The glimmering light flickered around them, and doubt crept back into her heart, the darkness whispering its malevolent truths. "Your past will consume you," it chorused, shadows pooling around, their hollow eyes searching, waiting for the fragile flicker of hope to dim. She closed her eyes tightly, willing the darkness away. Yet each breath felt heavier as the reality consumed her once more, as the shadows pulsed with a malevolent hunger, drawing ever closer. Lisa's voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the cacophony. We can't give in." Clara's eyes flew open, the shadows clawing hungrily, but the flicker of resolve ignited anew within her. "We are not our fears," she screamed into the void, the words bursting forth like a shield against the relentless tide, the bond between them solidifying into something bright and unyielding. The shadows shrank back, swirling wildly, fragmented faces shifting, their anguished cries igniting the air around them, and for a moment, the darkness faltered. "We are more," they shouted together, each pulse of light surging against the tide, refusing to bend beneath the weight of despair. But just as it seemed the darkness might retreat, a blinding flash erupted, and reality shifted around them. Clara found herself alone for an agonizing heartbeat, the shadows closing in, thick and suffocating, pulling her deeper into a churning void, resonance echoing as if the world itself twisted against her. "No!" she cried, adrenaline flooding her senses, racing through her as she felt the darkness latch onto her like a predator, its relentless hunger gnawing at her limbs. Fear gripped her tightly, twisting her resolve into something fragile as she fought the urge to be drawn backward into the abyss. Then, her thoughts flared, clinging to the memories of connection, the warmth of laughter, the spark of friendship, the sweet melody of hope reigniting within her. "I choose to fight," she shouted, pulling every ounce of strength, tossing the shadows aside, her voice resonating through the swirling darkness until it began to falter, the shadows hesitating. Just as Jake's voice broke through the gloom, "Together, Clara, we won't stop." The echo of it ignited something deep within her, an electric pulse of warmth shooting through her heart, pulling her back from the edge, knitting the fabric of their bond, each thread woven into a shield against the encroaching darkness. "We will not be lost," the chorus rose, their voices blending together in a symphony of defiance, weaving a tale of triumph against the shadows, stronger and more radiant than before. The darkness writhed in response, sinister shapes swirling, battling against their newfound light, twisting like smoke caught between the heavenly rays of dawn. Clara's heart raced as she felt the light pouring into the space, vibrant and unyielding, tearing through the suffocating shadows as her voice rose higher. "We will reclaim our lives." And as they pressed forward, light surged, forcing the shadows back, rupturing the veil of despair that had cloaked them. Just then, she glimpsed a face, a glimmering, radiant visage amid swirling shades, beckoning her, luminous and right against the encroaching blackness. "Don't give in," the visage sang, that voice a soothing balm against the chaotic din, anchoring her resolve, and she pushed past the fears swirling within her, seeking her friend's eyes with an intensity that tethered them all. The warmth ignited in a surge, filling them with strength, bursting free as shadows flickered and screeched like wild animals, desperately trying to reclaim them as they pressed into the limit of the void. Clara felt a rush of power, the dazzling energy swirling stronger, pushing back against the foe, and she breathed deep, willing it to break the last threads of anguish that tangled them within the dark. This was no mere battle. It was a reckoning, an exploration of the depths of their very souls, each individual strand illuminating the darkness, creating a shield that banished the nightmares persisting in their minds. In that vital moment, she understood the only way out was through, facing the shadows they had buried deep within, refusing to yield any further. The shadows howled back, attempting to drag her under, but with every surge of courage from the bond they forged, hope shone defiantly, illuminating the surroundings. Together, they yelled, hearts synchronized as one, slicing through the gloom that wrapped around them like chains, banishing the shadows that had clung on for far too long. But from deep in the darkness, a guttural growl morphed into a terrible roar, causing the very ground beneath them to shake violently, threatening to collapse under the sheer weight of despair. The vortex churned, shadows erupting into chaos, limbs grasping, forming a writhing mass that surged forward, eyes burning with hatred that promised to consume them whole. "Stay strong," Jake shouted. The tremor of his voice mingled with the chaos, pulling each of them back to the center of the light, urging them against the storm that brewed overhead. Mid-flight, it felt like something snapped, striking against her very soul, slapping her back to reality. This was their moment, a surge of light rippling through, forging a path out of nothingness. The heart-rending screams of lost souls flooded her senses, but the bond between them pulsed with unity, sending shockwaves through the shadows intent on dragging them down. The darkness howled, yet something in Clara's heart ignited, a will to push back, that resonated louder than the screams. They would not falter, not while they fought together. One step, then another, each movement sending tendrils of light shooting through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, driving back the monster who had clawed and slithered into the very core of who they were. Their resolve built upon a pulse of light that sliced through the chaos, illuminating the encroaching shadows that swirled with ferocity unmatched. Within the darkness, twisted faces morphed, each contorted visage seemingly torn from forgotten nightmares, haunted eyes staring longingly, hungering for their light. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if it carried the weight of despair from 1,000 lost souls, their cries echoing, enveloping them in a chilling embrace that sank deeper than fear itself. As they surged forward, the shadows recoiled, but not without resistance. With every step, shadows slashed through the air, tendrils lunging like serpents seeking warmth, grasping for their limbs, eager to pull them back into the swirling abyss from which they feared they'd never escape. "Keep moving," Lisa breathed, her voice strained yet unwavering, each word an ethereal spark glowing against the encroaching dark, but underneath it all, a faint tremor seeped through, betraying her own unease. Clara felt the icy grip of fear tightening around her throat, and the very ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an ominous, rhythmic beat, like a heart anticipating its prey. Each breath became a struggle, choking on the darkness, the scent of decay and despair creeping into their lungs, tasting bitter as they pressed deeper into the storm, the cacophony of lost souls howling like banshees clawing for release. With each echoing scream, shadows danced violently, flickering like candle flames in a tempest, revealing fleeting images of distorted pasts. Faces of loved ones twisted into empty grins, resembling the joys they had once shared now tainted by an insatiable hunger. There was a glimpse of clarity beneath the chaos. Brief, blinding memories flooded into her vision, moments of laughter now tainted, haunting visages merging with the shadows, elongating into unnatural shapes that writhed and twisted in agony, as if crying out for the warmth of connection they had once known, now enveloped in despair. The shadows surged again, and as they closed in, the ground beneath them began to shift, opening like a yawning mouth, a deep chasm that threatened to swallow their hope in one insatiable bite. Clara stumbled, and her heart raced wild within her chest as she felt the tremors beneath her feet transform into a violent quaking, as if the very fabric of reality threatened to rip itself apart, unhinging in a distorted frenzy. "We can't let it take us," she shouted, the urgency commanding the air around them. And though doubt lingered, a fierce determination began to rise, an electric current coursing through their link, urging them to focus. The shadows, sensing the resistance, twisted wretchedly, morphing into grotesque shapes that crawled towards them with a mind of their own, stretching toward their faces, freezing them in horrified stillness. Moments turned into an eternity as shapes began to whisper in a cacophony of voices, each word piercing through her mind like a shard of ice, echoing her deepest fears. "You will never escape," they hissed, and the chilling realization ignited within her. These were not mere shadows. They were fragments of her past, haunting and relentless, each one holding a mirror to every regret that had ever plagued her soul. Behind her, Jake shouted, "Look away! Don't listen!" But the words echoed eerily into the abyss, swallowed by the shadows that writhed hungrily around them, gnashing teeth aflame with the desperation of 1,000 anguished souls. The landscape warped further. The once recognizable shapes morphed into a twisted, labyrinthine nightmare. Hallways of distorted faces and anguished moans, each corner pulling them deeper away from hope, spinning into madness. Clara shielded her eyes, but visions slipped through, moments of defeat, each shadow reeling back to life, relentless in their pursuit of failures, lost opportunities, and bitter betrayals twisting around her, pinning her like a bug to a board. As the shadows lunged again, teeth snapping and claws reaching, she felt a piercing sense of loss that clawed at her heart, pulling her closer to surrender, urging her to cease the fight. "Together, we must hold on," came the cry from Lisa, but even behind those words lay the hints of despair, as though uncertainty coiled around each thread, whispering doubts that threatened to unravel them. She looked to Jake, whose features reflected a mix of fear and determination, battling against the shadows that slid through the air, searching for avenues of weakness. Their surroundings warped, twisting into a swirling cyclone of horror, the shadows reeking of old regrets, with long-forgotten faces peering back, eyes wide, mouths gaping in silent cries for salvation, each one drawing strength from their presence. The ground beneath them collapsed, revealing yawning pits of darkness that sucked in the light, breathing hunger that pulsed and writhed underneath them, waiting for the moment when despair would finally claim its prize. "Don't let it take you," Jake called out, but as they began to slip toward the edge, Clara felt the chill creeping in, wrapping around her limbs like chains, witnesses to a battle that seemed unwinnable, as if the darkness awaited their capitulation, grinning in satisfaction. A laugh erupted, sharp and echoing, reverberating against the claustrophobic walls of their nightmares, each sound like shards of glass slicing through the air, taunting their every effort. "This is only the beginning," it hissed, a chorus of laughter rippling through the shadows, curling like smoke towards the light, flickering defiantly, yet fighting an imminent demise as it clawed around them. Clara shut her eyes tight, battling the urge to look, the urge to succumb to the shadows entreating her, urging her to join the endless tide, to find solace within the blackened void. But in the depths of that swirling darkness, a shimmering light began to pulse in time with her heart, a reminder of the bond they shared in the fight they had ignited together. Gritting her teeth, she pulled outward, gathering her friends, feeling their hands pressed against hers, solid, warm, a lifeline anchoring her to reality against the encroaching horrors. "Together we are stronger," she whispered fiercely, the flickering light responding with a brilliant glow that pushed back against the abyss that threatened to swallow them whole. igniting a flicker of hope against the ever-looming tide of despair, a lifeline shimmering brightly in the darkness. And just as the shadows recoiled, she noticed a new shape forming in the haze, a looming silhouette dancing on the edges of her vision, its dark eyes boring into her soul, deepening the chilling grip of fear around her heart. The figure shifted closer, unfurling like smoke, revealing details sharp and menacing. A face agonizingly familiar, dark and sinister, one she had long buried, echoing through the halls of her past. "You let me down, Clara," it jeered, its voice slithering like a serpent, curling around her mind, a shiver creeping down her spine as it spoke, the weight of criticism dripping heavy with manipulation. While the shadows slashed and churned, searching for their prey, this figure stood apart, radiating darkness but exuding a twisted tenderness that sent tremors through her frame, like an old lover's touch gone awry. The other faces lurked behind, each intertwining, joining the cacophony as if welcoming their own familiar grievances, desires merging, whispering remnants of regret, the ever-present reminder of failures long past. Clara fought to hold her ground as the shadows swarmed back, arms reaching out, touching her, pulling, grappling for her very essence. "You cannot escape your past," the figure whispered, soft and honeyed, a seductive plea that beckoned her to let go, to give in, tear the threads of hope away from the bond they forged. Pulses quickened, the darkness surrounding them thickening, shifting, wrapping tighter around her heart like coils of steel, as the shadows loomed ever closer, attempting to embrace her with a chilling familiarity. But something within her flickered. A glimmer of defiance urged forward, igniting memories of laughter, the warm embrace of friendship, and the battles fought side by side against loss and fear, creating an anchor that held her firm against the tide. "We are not defined by our past," she shouted, the voice igniting the air around them, surging through every crevice, sending a shockwave against the shadows twisting in rebellion. Together, they cried, voices rising in unison, turning back the tide of despair that sought to drown them, the light igniting against the cacophony of animosity clamoring for their surrender. As they advanced, the tendrils writhed in response, spilling and gnarling. But Clara could still feel the familiar call of despair echoing from the depths, whispering promises of acceptance. The grotesque shapes shifted, their eyes narrowing as they began to swirl aggressively, morphing into monstrous forms, teeth bared, some specter of her own, making taunting her resolve, erupting into chaotic screams. And yet, amid those visceral shadows, a profound reality settled. They would lose everything if they surrendered to fear, if they stepped back into the abyss seeking comfort rather than facing the raw truth before them. In stark defiance, Clara moved forward, affirming their bond, as the light began to surge in response to her defiance, lashing against the tendrils that reached out like eager hands, revealing nightmares from the depths. "We are more," she screamed, locking eyes with Jake and Lisa, feeling them surge with renewed determination as the shadows recoiled, ripping against the momentum of their joined force, fracturing at the edges of the light that pushed back again. "We will not be consumed," echoed across the abyss, an undeniable roar rising from within, pouring into the air around them as they held tight amid the chaos, feeling the shadows shake and tremble, beginning to dissolve like mist under the sun. Yet the figure lingered, its haunting voice whispering soft promises that echoed back from the dark, promises of familiarity that twisted into something new. "Given Clara," it crooned, each syllable dripping despair, pulling her eye to the cracks where shadows melded with the light, every fragment a reminder of hope that flickered softly yet still sought to shine. The air began to vibrate, as if responding to the shadows' laughter merging through the whispers urging her to surrender. And for a brief moment, she felt a shadow of hesitation skitter through her bones, a tender caress attempting to coax her into relinquishing her fight. But as the cacophony swelled anew, the shadows teetered forward, clawing with desperate cries, an echo of what she might have been if she let fear reign in her heart, threatening to shatter everything she fought to reclaim. Instead of backing down, Clara clenched her fists tighter around her friend's own, determination flooding her veins, igniting every memory of love, laughter, and light, fueling her resolve against the swirling tempest. "We will shine," she stated, the burst of power pushing forth as if summoning the very stars themselves, illuminating the darkness with a fierce intensity that lunged back into the void. Their voices wove around her, a sanctuary of faith frothing amid the frail echoes of pain, myriad memories washing through, resonating within each pulse that cried out. Together, they would carve their own fate. "We choose to live," they proclaimed, voices intertwining, rising in crescendo, powerful enough to hold back the shadows and repelling the dark from engulfing them whole. And in that moment, light exploded forth, illuminating every dark crevice, banishing the chilly grip of despair, forcing the hunger that howled into the dark to recoil into shrieks of anguish. The shadows fractured, melding into chaos, each echo reverberating against the edges of existence, thrumming like a heart on the brink of collapse, finding its life renewed, echoing off the walls they had traversed. And as the shadows began to dissipate, they pressed forward against the tide, pushing against the darkness, threatening to pull them back, even as they surged toward the flickering light illuminating their path, a path forged by fight and unyielding unity. The bitter winds howled, clashing against the protective barrier they forged. Yet here in the light, the shadows now flickered like dying embers, refusing to take hold of their destinies any longer. But just as they surged through the barrier, hope hanging on the cusp of triumph, a shadow erupted in rage, more powerful than before, an entity of pure wrath that unleashed fury, twisting into forms unrecognizable. Its echoing laughter resonated through the air, dark joy spilling forth as it lunged towards them with renewed vigor, eyes burning like embers of hatred igniting everything in its path. "You think you can escape," it screeched, a cold void of fear blossoming within them, tendrils chasing after each flicker of light that erupted around. But Clara inhaled deeply, the warmth of friendship wrapping around her, each heartbeat affirming their bond, pushing against the terror that threatened to crush her spirit. "We will fight," she declared, her voice rising over the sound of chaos as they drew together, heartbeats synchronizing, an undeniable rhythm of unity, crafting a reservoir of strength against the pulsating. "We will fight," she declared, her voice rising over the sound of chaos as they drew together, heartbeats synchronizing, an undeniable rhythm of unity, crafting a reservoir of strength against the pulsating darkness that surrounded them. The shadow trembled slightly, as if shaken by the fierce determination radiating from them. For a moment, an eerie silence washed over the chaos, almost a peace nestled within the storm. But then, it unleashed an ear-piercing wail that sliced through the air, every note a reminder of anguish and despair that clawed at the edges of their minds. The very ground underneath them shifted, an unsettling groan emitting from the earth, reverberating through their bones, chilling them to the core. The walls around them oozed with a warm, thick darkness, slithering like a living entity, wrapping around their ankles, pulling with a ferocity that made breath hitch in their throats. Clara gasped, feeling the tales of the past grip her tighter, old fears sprouting anew like weeds in the cracks of their resolve. "Don't look back," Jake shouted, his voice strained as tendrils of shadow curiously reached for his face, curling wickedly around his features, trying to smother him in a twisted embrace. Lisa stood beside him, shaking, tears welling in her eyes, caught between terror and courage. "We must keep moving," she screamed, her voice cracking, eyes darting towards the ever-thickening fog that seemed to laugh at their plight. Turning toward the flickering light, they pushed through, hearts pounding wildly as shrieks echoed from the shadows, a grotesque cacophony of voices mingling, each one spelling out their fears. The darkness began to shift, forming grotesque shapes, twisted faces with hollow eyes, mouths gaping wide, whispering secrets that drifted like smoke into their minds. Each confession was a blade, a raw reminder of things left unspoken, unsaid, clawing at the edges of their sanity, clawing deeper into their hearts. You'll never escape. The amalgamation of voices crooned, an elegant seduction hidden within the chaos, promising solace only if they surrendered to the void. Clara felt a wave of despair crashing upon her, bubbling to the surface, trying to drown out the light, to smother their hope. The energy within her flickered like a candle in a storm, uncertain and frail, each heartbeat echoing the shadows that lurked ever closer. Yet, in a moment of raw clarity, she remembered her friends, their laughter echoing through her mind like a soothing balm against the encroaching darkness. "We're not alone," she shouted into the void, her voice echoing back, reverberating in the stillness, striking against the encroaching dread that sought to consume them alive. The shadows quivered, driven back slightly by her defiance, but the laughter only grew louder, more mocking. "You think your bonds are stronger than the abyss," it sneered, a rush of cold wind sweeping past, chilling them to their very souls, filling the air with an unsettling sense of foreboding. The ground split open beneath them, a gaping chasm of darkness yawning wide, threatening to swallow them whole. Clara felt herself tumbling, screaming as the void reached for her, tendrils grasping around her waist, pulling her into the depths below. "Clara!" Jake shouted, but his voice was mere whispers against the howling winds that rushed forth, wrapping tightly around her limbs, whispering thoughts dark and twisted, echoing every mistake she'd ever made. In a heart-stopping moment, she felt the warmth of her friends slip away, replaced by an eerie cold that seeped into her very essence. Fear seeped through her, clawing at her throat, leaving her gasping for air against the heavy weight of the shadows. But she refused to yield. Suddenly, from the depths of despair, she glimpsed a flash of light, flickering but resolute. It was a reminder of everything she fought for, of every joyous moment they had shared, pulsing amidst the choking darkness. The voices grew chaotic, a blend of laughter and rage, trying to siphon away her strength as she fought to cling to that light. "Find me!" Clara cried out, her voice determined and fierce, breaking through the cacophony. It was a single thought, a flicker of hope urging her friends to break through the haze, to remember their shared strength amidst the encroaching chaos. The darkness screeched, twisted bodies forming faces that contorted with anger and despair, attempting to pull her into a swirling maelstrom of anguish. "You belong to us," it growled, a visceral entity closer now, its breath hot against her skin, mingling with the tangible sorrow that clung to the air. Yet instead of faltering, Clara embraced the fear, allowing it to wash over her before casting it aside like a worn-out garment. "We will not be your prisoners," she shouted into the void, feeling the energy surge around her. Her friends' laughter echoed, as if answering her call, resonating through the darkness in defiance, forcing the shadows to retreat momentarily, revealing a path ahead. Yet the path was shrouded in mist, an unsettling fog laced with whispers that coaxed them toward despair, beckoning them with promises of eternal peace. "Listen to us," they whispered, seductive and familiar, teasing at the back of her mind. "Surrender and find your peace." Each step forward felt heavier, the ground beneath shifting like quicksand, as if reality itself sought to bind them in eternal sorrow. Clara fought the urge to pause, to succumb to the sweet temptation of accepting defeat. Together, she repeated over and over, the words fueling their resolve against the suffocating dark. But the dense fog twisted violently, swirling around them, swirling into shapes forming specters from their past, shadows that struck at their hearts, whispering secrets only they knew. "Remember your failures," it hissed, shadows flickering to expose the frailty of their unity, the cracks that began to show through their woven bond. The nagging doubt seeped in, echoes of their past failures dancing around, each voice a reminder of how fragile hope could be amid a raging storm. Darkness thickened again, creeping like icy fingers toward their resolve, dark laughter sinking deep into their resolve, trying to unravel the threads they had sewn together. Clara could feel the air grow heavy, the weight of dark promises wrapping around her heart. Why not give in? It implored, soft and seductive, coaxing her to close her eyes, to embrace the calm that came with surrendering. Why fight against your desires? It whispered, shadows swirling around, almost inviting her to step into their embrace, to finally find comfort amid the chaos. And for a fleeting moment, she felt the warmth around her friends dim as doubt cracked their fortress, drawing them closer to the edge. Stand firm, Jake's voice cut through the doubt, igniting a fire that ignited their wills, unyielding against the hunger that loomed. But Clara felt her resolve test again. The darkness writhed and twisted with renewed vigor, backlit by their hesitation, pushing against them with relentless fury as if sensing the cracks in their walls. The figures of regret and sorrow grew larger with each passing heartbeat, their hollow eyes boring into her soul, stripping away her last shreds of resolve. "This is your fate," it crooned, shadows entwining around them as the world around warped, growing darker, colder. Just as despair threatened to swallow them whole, Clara remembered the flicker of light, the bond that they forged, pure and untainted, illuminating the encroaching darkness. "Our light will not be extinguished," she cried defiantly, drawing upon the warmth of their friendship like a shield against the looming void, shoving the shadows further back, burning bright. The darkness recoiled, faces of despair screeching and howling in anger. Yet the power of their unity surged forward, pulsing like a heartbeat interwoven with light. Yet the grip of the shadows still lingered, clawing for a way back into their thoughts, whispering reminders of those they had lost, amid the encroaching tide, threatening every ounce of hope they had built. "Embrace the darkness and relinquish your pain," they urged, voices mingling like a chilling symphony that echoed all around, twisting and curling around their consciousness. Clara felt the shadows creeping nearer, swallowing every ounce of her courage as visions of loss danced before her eyes, tormenting her with haunting images, faces long gone, touched with sorrow. "Give in," it rasped, fingers of shadow caressing her, each whisper a deep-rooted reminder of her mistakes, cloaked in promises of freedom from pain. But she clung tightly to the flickering light, to the laughter and the warmth, realizing that therein lay her true power. "We cannot give up," she shouted, feeling the surge of energy pulse through her veins, awakening the dormant strength hidden away, ready to break free against the looming threat. The shadows writhed in response, as if aware their grasp was faltering, becoming desperate, each movement unsettling, a grotesque dance in the depths of despair. And then, amid the chaotic swirl, something shifted in the air, a shift she couldn't quite grasp, but it whispered promises of something beyond, deeper than the darkness around. The light intensified, pulling at her sense of self, illuminating the way forward, as paths twisted and turned amidst unspeakable anguish. "This way," came a voice, soft yet firm, echoing from within the light. For a fleeting second, Clara hesitated as tendrils of fear wrapped around her heart, pulling at her mind, trying to draw her back toward the shadows that licked at her heels. But just as despair threatened to claim her, she glimpsed Jake and Lisa, their faces alight with determination, eyes burning with fierce resolve. "There is no darkness we cannot overcome," they shouted, and together they pushed forward, creating a bursting aura that radiated through the gathering storm. The shadows shrieked in fury, the sounds a whirlpool of agonized wails that reverberated against the walls, shaking as if the very earth was disturbed by their declaration. With each step they took, the ground felt steady beneath them, a pulse of strength emanating, pushing against the tide that sought to sweep them away. Yet, the overpowering presence loomed closer, distorting the light around, thickening the air with a suffocating dread that swallowed hope again. "You will witness what lies ahead," the haunting voice echoed, morphing and blending into a cacophony, draping around them like a suffocating shroud of regret. And though the shadows twisted viciously, they could feel the ground trembling beneath their feet, each step a clarion call against the darkness, signifying they would press onward at any cost. With renewed vigor, Clara and her friends surged forward, hearts beating wildly, forging a path through the chaos. ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead, knowing together they could fight back the void that sought to consume them. But as the veil of shadow began to part, revealing an abyss teeming with nightmares, a chill enveloped them, foreboding and precise, as if time itself strained against the pressure, the weight of fate threatening to consume them all. As the veil of shadow began to part, a chilling silence enveloped them, thick as fog. The air was ripe with tension, palpable and electric, as if the very atmosphere held its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Clara could feel the icy fingers of dread curling around her heart, tightening with each passing moment. The world around them warped like a mirror reflecting their nightmares, whispers crawling from the corners of her mind, taunting them with memories best forgotten. Her gaze was caught by a flicker at the edge of the abyss, a shadow moving unnaturally, slithering like a serpent in the dark. "Stay close," Jake muttered, his voice wavering just slightly, betraying the bravado he tried to maintain. The fog began to thicken again, slithering through their feet like hunting snakes, preparing to wrap around their ankles and drag them into the depths. With each step, the sounds of the world outside faded, replaced by a chorus of faint, tortured wails that seemed to swirl in the air, beckoning them to turn back. And there beneath the whispers, they caught sight of shapes, distorted forms huddled in the darkness, their faces obscured but their eyes glinting with a terrifying hunger. Clara felt a chill run down her spine as one figure broke from the huddle, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate gait, skin pale as bone, mouth stretching into a grotesque grin that sent shivers coursing through her veins. Behind it, the others shifted, their movement eerily synchronized as if they were marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer, each limb disjointed, moving in unnatural rhythm. "Come join us," it croaked, voice slithering through the air, cold and sweet like poison, echoing eerily as if it had weighed the very fabric of reality. The group stumbled backward, Clara's heart racing as she felt the shadows tightening around her, clinging to her like ivy, whispering secrets just beyond her reach. "Don't listen," Lisa whispered, but the words felt thin against the clamor of the abyss, the urgency lost in the multitude of voices vying for their attention. As if sensing their hesitation, the figures surged forward, a tide of chattering teeth and moth-like faces, their hollow eyes boring into her, revealing all the regrets she had buried deep within her. Images flashed before Clara, a cacophony of her past mistakes, the echoes of laughter now twisted into mocking jeers, each one a rattling reminder of her deepest insecurities, clawing at her sanity. "You belong with us now," they hissed in an ensemble of terrifying harmony, urging her to embrace the shadows that flickered at the edge of her vision. Clara's fingers tingled with fear, her fight against the urge to flee solidifying her resolve, but the pull was almost unbearable as dread seeped in, clouding her thoughts with despair. As they held their ground, the ground around them began to tremble violently, the abyss gaping wider, exhaling a breath of decay that felt like a fog thick with sorrow, suffocating her as she struggled to breathe. The figures loomed closer, long skeletal hands reaching out, claw-like fingers grazing Clara's skin, their touch cold and electric, igniting a panic that erupted in her throat. "Don't give in," Jake shouted, his voice breaking through the haze, but the shadows were relentless, their whispers threading through their minds, trying to sow seeds of doubt, fear twisting like knife blades inside. One by one, the shapes began to morph, shifting into faces she recognized, loved ones lost, twisted into monstrous versions of themselves, eyes glistening with hunger and longing. "We miss you," they pleaded, the words slithering into her thoughts, congealed with sorrow as if they could dissolve her resolve, wrapping around her heart like a vice grip. Clara stumbled back, eyes wide, unable to tear her gaze away from the nightmarish spectacle unfolding, tangled emotions warring within her. "No," she cried, shaking her head violently, but each scream was drowned out by the cacophony of despair, her mind swirling into chaos, filled with the echoes of failure and loss. Yet, through the whirlwind of sorrow, a flicker of warmth sparked, a memory that clawed its way to the surface. Joy experienced with friends, laughter amidst the storm, pulling her back from the precipice of despair. The figures recoiled for a moment, as if struck by an unseen force, their distorted faces contorting into primal rage, shadows writhing with fury as they sensed her resistance. "Don't resist," they howled in unison, a dissonant chorus that echoed with echoes of their fading hopes, longing stretching taut like a string ready to snap. But Clara grasped tightly to that flicker, feeling the light burning against the icy grip, summoning the strength she never knew was within her. "We are not alone," she declared, voice trembling yet firm, feeling it resonate through the suffocating darkness, forcing it to shudder back slightly. The shadows hissed, eyes narrowing, faces twisting in primal terror as the flicker of hope pushed against the maelstrom of despair. Just as it seemed they would crush her resolve entirely, a figure stepped forward from the swirling mist, an apparition cloaked in light. Together, it whispered, voice soft but ringing with authority, as tendrils of light began to weave around them like a protective barrier, illuminating the darkness inch by inch. The shadowy figures wailed in utter dismay, clawing at the light, their forms flickering and dissolving as if they were made of smoke, persistently hungry but suddenly fearful of the brilliance surrounding them. "Keep holding on," Jake shouted, fear coursing through his voice as he instinctively stepped closer to Clara, their arms brushing together, the warmth radiating like a shield against the creeping chill. Ghostly cries filled the air, a cacophony of agony as the light surged forward, scattering shadows as it illuminated the twisted expressions and despairing faces, revealing moments of their darkest memories now laid bare before them. "Stand firm," Lisa echoed, lifting her arm, feeling the warmth enveloping them like a protective cocoon as the mist began to lift, hopes melding into something unyielding. With a fierce determination, Clara thrust her arm forward, feeling the light extend beyond them, reaching further into the abyss, urging the shadows to relent, to find the humanity hidden deep within. For a fleeting moment, she caught sight of the grotesque beings retreating, faces twisting in anguish, shadows escaping like vapors in the wind, almost pleading for release. But what was that lurking further back, something darker still? Some unseen force hovering beyond, sensing their triumph, yet silently plotting, cocooned in the darkness, waiting for the moment they would falter. The tension in the air thickened, each heartbeat echoing louder than the last, as the light shined brighter, threatening to wash away the very essence of their fears. But an unsettling stillness settled in, and as the last of the shadows recoiled, they realized they had only scratched the surface, that something more sinister lay just beyond their reach, blending in with the suffocating darkness that threatened to consume them once more. Clara felt the ground beneath them tremble, a deep rumble shaking her from her grasp of hope. The walls of the abyss shifting and peeling back, exposed to reveal the horror of a deeper layer enshrouded in darkness. "This isn't over," a low growl resonated, chilling her bones as the specters faded into the shadows, peeling back to reveal an even darker entity looming just beyond, waiting with an insatiable hunger that seemed to consume all light. The very ground churned where moments ago they had forged their path, now shifting like liquid shadows, pulsing ominously, each tremor threatening to pull them under once again. "Run!" Jake shouted, but there was nowhere to flee as the abyss broadened, drawing closer, what lay beneath now reaching out, hungry for their fear, readying itself for the final act of cruelty. The pulse beneath their feet gained momentum, a drumbeat echoing the dread that began to mirror their own hearts, an ominous reminder that in the darkness, something else awaited, more terrifying than the lurking shadows they had faced. The air thickened, twisted laughter bubbling up from the depths, an evil, heinous sound that sent a ripple of terror through Clara's core, paralyzing any thoughts of escape. It was a cacophony of whispers and slithering sounds, coiling around them, a reminder that they were entering uncharted territory, realms untouched where nightmares festered, rotten with intention. With a final surge of adrenaline, They leaped away from the imminent grasp, but the shadows thrashed in response, pulsating like the haunting echoes of a heartbeat, deep and resonant, luring them closer to the brink of desperation as tendrils dug viciously further. "Keep moving," Lisa yelled, determination tearing through the fog. But with every step, the darkness clung tighter, shadows weaving into a web, intent on dragging them down, teasing them with their own whispered fears and regrets. The path grew narrower, the ground a treacherous chaos where hope flickered faintly, snuffed out by the tightening grip of shadows eager to pull them back into a void filled with despair. The darkness convulsed, revealing gaps that seemed alive, gaping maws hungering fiercely as Clara's breath quickened, a primal fear gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. And as they frantically moved forward, they glimpsed shadows coalescing behind them in a darkened swirl, a vortex swirling as laughter echoed, inhuman, pitched, exciting chills cascading down their spines. "You cannot escape," came that familiar voice again, resonating with a sinister glee, the very fabric of reality rippling as the laughter morphed into a cacophony of everyone they cherished, each voice layered in agony and mockery. The figures they once fought now lined the path, faces twisted in despair, yet eerily familiar, seeking to join them, now part of the shadows, grinning in derision as the darkness began to swell in time with their panicked hearts. The shadows surged forward, their forms morphing into twisted reflections of the friends' own faces, despondent and haunting as if they were taunting them, beckoning with skeletal fingers. "Join us," they cooed in a sing-song voice, a mesh of sorrow and malice bobbing like a moth around a flame. The air grew thick, each breath labored as the oppressive weight of despair pressed heavier upon their chests, squeezing the last drops of hope from their souls. Clara felt her knees weaken, the darkness swirling around her ankles, pulling her down into a whirlpool of memories that clawed at her mind, reminding her of every moment where she had faltered, every word left unspoken. The faces of lost friends twisted in the shadows morphed into pained expressions, and she heard echoes of laughter turning into cries that burned through her thoughts, wrapping around her mind like a shroud. "We're waiting, Clara," a familiar voice called out, wedged in between the sinister murmurs, tugging at the seams of her sanity. The ground buckled beneath her feet, darkness swirling and churning as if alive and hungry, a chasm threatening to swallow them whole. "Keep moving," Jake yelled, urgency slicing through the oppressive atmosphere, his hand grasping Clara's arm, a lifeline tethered against the gathering storm. As their feet took uncertain steps forward, the shadows danced at the corners of their vision, flickering like candle flames extinguished only to burst back into ghastly light, asserting their presence, weaving knots of panic in their hearts. Fear wrapped around Clara's throat, choking her as whispers echoed in her ears. Softer now, yet wrapping around her like silk threads, weaving a tapestry of dread that pushed her further into despair. "We miss you," they murmured, the words sweet yet laced with bitterness, carving into her psyche, twisting deeper with every heartbeat, pulling memories from a grave she'd thought well buried. "You're one of us now," the shadows hissed, shifting underfoot, attempting to merge with the very fabric of her being, the tantalizing promise of belonging wrapped tightly around her heart. The darkness surged forward as the ground cracked open, fissures gaping wide like mouths ready to swallow the light whole. And within, she sensed something more vile, something that had been awakened, and its hunger was palpable. A low growl vibrated through the air, hinting at something lurking in the depths, something ancient, waiting, its presence twisting the air into a choking grip, amplifying the fear that felt like a live wire coursing through her veins. Clara heard a scream, raw and desperate, as if echoing from the cores of the earth, and then silence. A silence that was so profound it made her ears ring, tightening, her chest as though all breath had been stolen. All at once, shadows thickened, congealing and pulling closer, a flood of darkness where the light dared not tread. Panic clawed at her throat, and she fought to see through the enveloping blackness. But nothing seemed real. Nothing felt safe. Her pulse raced, matching the rhythm of unseen feet creeping ever closer, surrounding them with whispers that suddenly crescendoed into a blood-curdling roar, a cacophony of voices clawing at her mind, a symphony of lost souls intertwined. "We are many," they chanted, their voices layering like a cold wind rustling through dead leaves, each syllable digging into her psyche, chains of despair wrapping tighter with every word. Then, just beyond the line of shadows, a figure emerged, cloaked in a shroud of deeper black, eyes glowing with a malevolent light that pierced through the dark, finding Clara's own terrified gaze and locking onto it with an unyielding grip. It stepped forward, its movement deliberate, almost languid, as if savoring the moment as it glided toward her, shadows swirling in its wake, each step pulling the darkness closer, suffocating the light that dared to linger. "You think you can escape?" Its voice was a low growl, seductive yet frightening. The promise of something inescapable dripped from its words, lingering in the air like death itself. With every heartbeat, Clara felt the walls of reality bend around her, the very space growing oppressive, wrapping her in a cocoon of fear that pulsed like a living entity, each thud reverberating through her bones. In that instant, a thought flared within her, a tiny spark. Not surrender, not yet. Welling up from an instinct buried deep, she began to move, casting her gaze around, searching for any glimmer of courage able to pierce the thick, choking darkness. "We are stronger together," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute, cutting through the fog of despair wrapping around them like an old rug. But the shadows merely laughed, a cruel, dissonant choir echoing through the suffocating air, their voices a torrent of remorse wrapped in sinister mockery. "You do not understand," they hissed, pouring over her like a flood, threatening to wash away every ounce of defiance she clung to. But a sliver of conviction burned, a flame refusing to be snuffed. Then, as if in response to her fortitude, the ground roared, shaking violently, pulling the foundation out from under them. And within that moment, cracks spiderwebbed through the earth, letting out a dark, unnatural energy. The shadows recoiled, twisting back to the edges, revealing glimpses of light that flickered like distant stars, tiny beacons in the sea of overwhelming darkness, and Clara felt a swell of hope rising amidst the carnage. "Stand your ground," Jake bellowed once more, his rallying cry breaking through the desolation, igniting their shared resolve as they huddled together, their bond a lifeline in the merciless abyss. But the figure, the one cloaked in darkness, lingered close, its presence like ice coiling around her spine, and she could feel the weight of its intent pressing heavily against her, feeding on the fear that radiated off them in waves. "Give in," it urged, voice laced with a silky menace, its eyes swirling kaleidoscopes of despair that threatened to unravel her very essence. And for a split second, she felt her grip on reality waver, her mind whispering treasonous thoughts filled with longing for a release from the burden of her own existence. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing against the internal implosion, a struggle echoing between the light and shadow, one representing all she feared, the other a beacon of her fading hope lingering just out of reach. "Together," she murmured, as if that one word held the power to unify them against the looming dread, her voice gaining strength with every syllable, urging her friends to hold on tighter, against the relentless shadows yearning for their despair. "Together," echoed Jake, his voice strong, anchoring her, as they all joined hands, a chain unbroken in the relentless darkness, the warmth coursing like electricity through their collective fears, igniting defiance against the encroaching void. The shadows seemed to scream, twisting violently, shaking with anger, as if the very essence of what made them were shattered, struggling against their bond, pulsing with an agony that was almost palpable. "You cannot resist forever," the dark figure hissed, its expression twisting into a diabolical grin, revealing rows of teeth sharp as knives, promising that their unity would crumble, that despair would find its way back into their hearts. But Clara took a deep breath, drawing strength from her friends, her voice rising above the crescendo of chaos. "We won't let go," she cried, feeling the light within flaring back to life, illuminating their path even as the shadows writhed and twisted, unsure of their next move. And with that declaration, the darkness momentarily recoiled, the glow around them brighter, feeding off their determination, illuminating the edges of the moment and creating fissures where there once had been voids. But far beyond, in the uncharted depths, something older than time stirred, a hunger awakening, sensing the spark of resistance, preparing to unleash its final form, an unfathomable terror poised to engulf them all. The atmosphere shifted, turning heavy, winds whipping up debris from the abyss, swirling around them like 1,000 tendrils grasping desperately for their essence, ready to ensnare any flicker of hope before it soared too high. Clara, feeling the tension swell, urged her feet to move, instincts screaming now as the suffocating grip of dread clawed at her throat. The shadows lurking just beyond the edges, hungry and relentless, daring her to falter. Together, she murmured to her friends, each word a mantra smoothing out the edges of fear, binding them tightly within a fading light. An oath, stirring a flicker of courage against the unrelenting onslaught. But as they turned to face what lay ahead, the blackness poured forth like paint spilled upon a canvas, spilling into every corner, wrapping around them, whispering seductive promises that ignited the shadows in their hearts, tying them to the looming specter, melding their essence into one terrifying form. The very air churned with anticipation, and Clara's stomach dropped, sensing the presence of something dreadful, something emerging from the depths, dark and insatiable, prepared to seize upon their fears and drag them into the unending nightmare beyond comprehension. "Hold tight," she screamed, just as the abyss itself unleashed a guttural roar, the very ground beneath starting to collapse, shaking like a massive beast awakening from an eons-long slumber. And so they propelled forward into the oncoming tempest, heartbeats thrumming in time with the shadows racing to claim them whole. Clara and her friends pushed forward, hearts pounding in sync, the weight of dread pressing down like a suffocating fog. With every step, the ground beneath them trembled as if alive, curling and stretching, the very earth echoing with unnatural sounds, deep growls resonating from the chasms erupting around them. The air grew thick, colder than ice, stealing the warmth from their skin. She could feel the chill seep into her bones, wrapping around her like a vice. Shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, whispering secrets that turned her stomach, each flicker of movement sending jolts of fear racing through her. "Where are we going?" A voice quivered in the silence, the uncertainty palpable as whispers circled, growing louder, almost pleading. Jake shot a glance over his shoulder, trying to pierce the darkness that lingered just beyond their reach. The shadows clung to him like spiders, caressing his skin with icy fingers, feeding on his anxiety. "We have to keep moving," Clara urged, barely recognizing the tremor in her own voice. She turned her attention back to the murky depths looming ahead, where darkness spilled out like ink. It felt alive, writhing in response to their fears, trying to intercept any glimmer of hope. As they pressed forward, the whispers transformed into laughter, hollow and mocking. It echoed around them, spiraling into a warped symphony. "You can't escape," the shadows jeered, their laughter slicing through the fog like a blade, burrowing into their thoughts, self-doubt igniting a sense of dread that clawed at their hearts. The walls of darkness seemed to close in, and with each step, the ground trembled harder, almost like a heartbeat thrumming below, contrasting with the silence above. Clara caught a glimpse of something in the periphery, a movement fleeting, barely tangible. A flicker of light emerged momentarily, illuminating a face twisted in agony, mouth opening with a silent scream. "Did you see that?" she gasped, spinning towards her friends. But their eyes were glued forward, lost in the terror of what lurked ahead, oblivious to the horrors creeping at the edges of their vision. Was it a ghost? A figment of her imagination? The echoing screams of the lost reverberated in her mind, feeding her anxiety. "Keep your head up," Jake urged, yet the quiver in his tone belied his bravery. He took the lead, stepping cautiously toward the path ahead, where the shadows writhed, visibly discontent with their determination. Glowing eyes emerged from the depths, watching, calculating. The air felt heavy, saturated with anticipation, waiting for the moment of defeat. Clara felt a fine layer of sweat coat her skin, her heart racing. Shadows morphed into figures, elongated limbs stretching toward them, grasping, hungry for warmth and life. The ground cracked open, revealing gaping maw-like fissures that threatened to swallow them whole. "We need to hurry," she shouted, adrenaline surging. As they picked up speed, a thick smog poured from the cracks, weaving through the air, thickening with every breath. It pulsed around them like the beat of a monstrous heart, a sentient fog with intent. The laughter echoed louder, drowning out their footsteps, its tone shifting from jest to something sinister. "Join us," they called, voices layering into a chant that slithered into Clara's ears, mixing pleasure with despair, promising better days if only they'd relinquish their struggle. "Don't listen," Jake yelled, desperation in his voice as he clutched Clara's arm tighter. They stumbled forward, but the shadows lurked closer now, slinking just beside them. She could feel the weight of their gaze, an unrelenting pressure that bore down on her, relentless and cruel. A scream shattered the air, piercing, raw, filled with anguish. A figure appeared within the darkness, limbs twisted unnaturally, its face a mask of terror. It stumbled towards them, eyes wide with panic and despair, as if it were fleeing from something even darker behind it. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the creeping shadows. The atmosphere felt electric, and Clara's mind raced. Every instinct told her to run, to escape the grasp of the creeping darkness threatening to engulf them whole. Yet here they were, frozen by the realization that the darkness knew them intimately, whispering worries and fears that tied them to it, as if it were part of them. "Stay close," Jake shouted again, pushing forward, his voice breaking through the fog of despair. But the darkness only howled in response, the laughter resounding again, more frantically, drowning out his words. It felt like a storm bearing down, wind swirling with unpredictable ferocity, threatening to sweep them away. The ground shifted beneath them, and suddenly, a rift formed, jagged edges yawning wide, a gaping abyss, a reminder of what awaited those who faltered. From within the shadows, a torrent of frigid air rushed up, carrying with it the smell of decay, the sensation of being dragged back, roots of despair pulling at their feet, trying to root them in place. An unsettling noise reverberated, low and guttural, as if something colossal was awakening from deep below. The laughter transformed into a low, rhythmic chant, matching the pulsation of whatever was stirring beneath them, an ancient force beckoning to claim the living. As Clara's gaze darted around them, desperate to find a semblance of safety, her heart sank when she spotted ghostly hands reaching from the cracks, clawing toward the group, desperate and pained. She felt the energy drain from her, fear clawing its way down her throat, threatening to choke her. "They're trapped," she cried out, horrified. The entities flailed in agony, their spectral forms twisting, melting into the shadows. The sticky tendrils of cold darkness coiled around their legs, more insistent now, urging them to yield, to bow to the belonging only dark despair could grant. "Fight!" Jake shouted, his voice raw, determination igniting a spark inside her. The shadows ricocheted with fury at the command, convulsing violently, drenching the air with palpable rage, but they refused to break. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pulling together every ounce of strength, every heartbeat urging them to keep resisting, to fight back against the overwhelming abyss. "Stay united," she yelled, reaching for her friends, pooling their energy into an invisible shield against the encroaching gloom. But just as she did, the darkness surged forward, crashing against their makeshift barrier with the force of a tidal wave. "You cannot escape your fate," the shadows roared, enveloping them, drowning out their resolve, its form shifting and writhing as it pressed against them, threatening to pull them into its depths, to strip away their humanity. The laughter echoed in waves of despair, cracking through her defenses, And in that moment, fear gripped her throat once more. Clara opened her eyes to see Jake fighting against the onslaught, but behind him loomed the sinister figure from before, its eyes burning with an undying hunger. It stood there, almost watching them closely, savoring their struggle, feeding off their fear. "We have to go," she cried, but her plea felt weak against the weight of shadows closing in, darkness swirling, melding with their vision. Time stretched, every instant feeling like eternity as panic slid into confusion, clutching at their minds, dragging down their resolve. The weight became unbearable, each breath a struggle as the shadows pressed in. Everything around her began to pulse with a deep, unnatural rhythm, pulling them further into the abyss. Shadows twisted together, weaving tales of their despair, shadows of past failures whispering indecipherable truths that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. Together, she screamed, summoning whatever she could muster, her voice carrying through the tempest, piercing through the creeping darkness that sought to define them. And yet, even as she rallied, the chilling laughter resumed, a malevolent undertone lurking beneath, the certainty that this was merely the beginning of something far more malicious. The past is a cage, the darkness hissed, voices intertwining in a crescendo, each word conviction wrapping tautly around her heart. "Embrace it, and you shall be free." The shadows lunged forward, feral, grasping at their limbs, but the force of their connection held. They had become one, a heartbeat against the encroaching darkness. Each step became a battle of wills, facing the flood of despair threatening to tear them apart, slowly but steadily pushing them back toward the brink. The figure loomed closer, its grin widening, and revealing rows of teeth glistening like obsidian. "You will join us," it growled, the dark timbre thick with malicious intent. With each creeping step it took, the shadows shifted, as if curling around its very essence, anticipating its command. Clara dug her heels in, channeling every ounce of perseverance. "We won't let you win," her voice rang out, clarity cutting through the haze, igniting a fire in her friend's expressions, and for an instant, it felt like they could hold against the tide. But the laughter swelled, enveloping them anew, breathing more darkness into the air, the abyss more relentless, more demanding of their flesh and soul. Shadows coiled tighter, constricting around them, losing the boundary between feeling and existence, blending endlessly until nothing could distinguish the living from the dead. "We're not done yet," Jake bellowed, a defiant spark igniting in his eyes as they pressed forward, resolving to confront the darkness, a moving force matched only by their shared terror. With every step, they felt the weight of countless souls, hearing their anguish echo as the shadows obscured the path ahead. Clara took a breath, deep, trembling, yet filled with purpose. Joining hands, they surged ahead, forcing their way through the encroaching darkness, energy crackling between them, and the darkness writhed in response, refusing to yield easily. They could feel the ground crumbling beneath their feet, but with collective determination, they pushed on deeper, into the heart of the storm that sought to consume them whole, where the ground twisted and turned beneath, threatening to collapse everything they were. Clara and her friends pressed on, catching the edges of their breaths, each inhale filled with the weight of panic. The ground seemed to pulse again, shaking beneath their feet, as if something ancient was awakening. From its deep slumber, stretching its limbs, cracking bones echoing through the void. Just ahead, a flickering lantern, swaying gently in the thickening fog, drew their attention. It beckoned them closer, an oasis in the oppressive darkness. But as they approached, the light began to flicker more wildly, casting eerie shadows that twisted and morphed, distorting their figures into grotesque parodies of themselves. Clara squinted, trying to make sense, only to see that the shadows were not mere tricks of the light. The shadows morphed into faces, countless eyes peering from the darkness, twisted mouths silently screaming, as if trapped in their own hell. Her heart raced painfully in her chest, an instinct screaming to run, to flee from the unholy vision. "We have to go back," she whispered, voice trembling, but Jake shook his head. "We can't," he said, his jaw set with determination, yet the glimmer of fear lingered in his eyes. "We'll find a way out together." Clara felt doubt creeping in, like the shadows around them, so close now that they felt the icy breath of despair. A coldness wrapping around her, tightening like a noose. Shimmering figures shimmered in and out, the flickering light illuminating faces of those who had been lost, their eyes sunken, haunted by timeless pain. "How many are there?" she thought, desperately holding on to her sanity, as the figures loomed closer, mocking and whispering their dark secrets, the cacophony blending into a growling hum. They seemed to reach forward, longing for warmth and comfort, as if recognizing them, wanting to pull them into their eternal gloom. "Stop!" she shouted, but the sound was swallowed by the forceful winds swirling all around. The shadows screeched, the voices melding into a single, piercing wail, echoing her own fears. Her friend stumbled back, hesitation taking root, but Jake tightened his grip, insistent. Just when hope seemed lost, the ground heaved violently, cracks snaking into life, tearing apart, sending plumes of dust spiraling into the air, obscuring everything in choking darkness. Clara couldn't tell which way was up anymore. Amidst the chaos, visions flickered, painting nightmarish scenes in her mind. The faces twisted and contorted. Some were familiar, each a memory tainted, replaying. Moments of regret that rapidly turned to horror. Was this what awaited them? Their past coming back to haunt them. A smothering weight of failure. They could never escape? Then, as instant as it began, the rumble stopped. An unsettling silence wrapped around them, cold and thick as shadows curled back, adjusting to the absence of sound. Bright eyes blinked in the darkness, watching, waiting for their next move, and claustrophobia draped heavily over their shoulders. "Do you feel that?" Beck whispered, voice barely above a breath, fear clawing its way into their hearts. That paralyzing stillness, each second ticking by, stretching into eternity until it became unbearable. Clara could taste the panic in the air, a metallic tang that filled her mouth. Jake's grip slackened slightly, and she could sense his heartbeat matching the increasing rhythm of dread. "This way," someone urged suddenly, the voice distorted by the shadows, but it felt like a lifeline woven of silk, an illusion, fragile but persistent. They turned abruptly, the flickering lantern now burning fiercely, casting a blinding glow against the encroaching dark. As they moved deeper into the abyss, the ground underfoot felt unstable, and moments later, a gaping hole opened beneath, its depths impossible to fathom. Like teeth, its edges gleamed, a dark portal beckoning them when they neared the edge. The whispering grew louder, voices clamoring, grabbing at their thoughts, nudging them to take what felt like a final step into oblivion. Clara yanked back, fear flooding her senses, but Jake surged ahead. "We can't stop here," he shouted, the urgency causing echoes to ricochet through the void. The darkness pulsed, like a living entity, writhing to consume them whole. It felt as if it could taste their fear, thriving off their hesitation, gaining strength as they faltered. Her mind raced, desperate to make sense of their plight. "If we give in, we lose everything," she thought, but just then Jake's foot slipped, and he tumbled backward, the void widening beneath him. Except he didn't fall. It was as if the shadows had paused, holding him in place, not letting him go. There was a moment, a flash, where clarity seeped through the darkness. This was not a place of escape. This was a front row seat to their doom. Clara could only watch as tendrils of darkness curled around Jake, yanking him closer to that gaping chasm. "Help," he cried, but the shadows drowned it out. Not even an echo was left behind. The space around him folded in, blurring lines of reality until they melded, heartbeat matching the rhythm of despair. From the hole, a cold whisper flowed, promising him peace, and something deep within called to him. "No," Clara gasped, but she felt the threat near. The air crackled like static, and with it, the figures re-emerged, silent lips curled in twisted amusement, watching the events unfold. The tendrils twisted tighter, drawing Jake away from their grasp. But something drove him deeper into the shadows. Clarity slipped, panic rose, every breath heavy like lead. The once blinding light dimmed, an ominous reminder of what awaited. Clara lunged forward, hands reaching into the depths of swirling darkness. But there was no substance, no comfort, no warmth, just the gnashing of teeth echoing softly. "We will pull him back," Beck cried, but uncertainty hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The shadows lunged closer, entangling her wrist, but she pulled away, the void taunting her obedience. Each scream reverberated as Jake's face twisted in terror, his eyes wide with horror. But then the void widened between them, feet slipping from solid ground, as panic worked its way into every fiber of their being. They could feel the pulsating heart of darkness, thrumming against them, a heartbeat that mirrored their own. The shadows shifted, and then suddenly they receded, opening a hollow space drenched in light. Yet it felt cruel and bright, a spotlight on their suffering. This is our fault," Clara stammered, the realization clawing at her. The shadows were only shadows, but they thrived on them, pulling energy, feeding off them, delighted in their strife. "We need to fight back," Beck shouted, pulling each of them closer in a huddle. And Clara felt the surge of assurance. For a brief moment, they were united against the dark, determined not to become just another flicker in this chaotic orchestra. With whatever little strength remained, in a shaky voice, Clara called out, "We are not afraid." The words rang, radiating a glow that pushed against the suffocating darkness, just barely illuminating their path. The shadows shivered, retreating, growing angry at their defiance. Before they could reason, Jake's voice called out again, "Over here!" Each step toward him became heavier, the shadows roaring in rage, fighting to reclaim what they sought to consume, to tear them apart. But the brightness began to grow, the light both daunting and fierce. Together, they surged, resistance igniting a fire deep, where compassion settled, and with a newfound courage, they charged into that blinding light. The shadows roared, vibrating, through the air, searching, grasping, to take them into cold depths of despair. But as the light surrounded them, they could feel the tendrils unwinding, the icy grip loosening. Clara grabbed Jake's hand, and Beck pulled them both into the embrace of the light. "Hold on," she yelled, bracing as the shadows lunged forward, lashing out in desperate fury, the voices spilling out like streams of ink, like a flood of anger. As the light pulsed around them, the shadows began to dissipate, their anguished cries retreating, fading into whispers, echoing along the edges of the void. But it was not over yet. The hunger of the shadows lurked, patiently waiting to draw them back in, ready to claim them the moment their guard fell. They braced themselves, but what lay ahead of them was still unknown, a path unfolding that whispered their names, calling them forward, even as the darkness clawed at their heels. A reminder that even in light, shadows would chase them, waiting for the moment of weakness, when they would come to reclaim what they once lost. Clara felt their hearts racing in unison as the path ahead twisted, its contours smothered in an unsettling glow. Each step echoed with a rhythm of dread, the silence wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket, darkness lingering just beyond the edges of their vision. The shadows, moments before a world apart, now pressed against the light that seemed to pulse like a living heart. Illusion danced at the corners of her mind, each flicker bringing faces, not just solid figures, but parts of their lives recreated in torment. A cascade of memories flooded forth, the laughter of lost friends twisted into screams, the warmth of familiar embraces morphing into chains of ice around their hearts. Clara halted, breath hitching. "We can do this, we have to." But between her thoughts loomed the threat, a presence that rubbed unnaturally against her thoughts, eroding their determination, gnawing at the edges of what little resolve remained. The shadows reached out with claw-like hands, grasping at their ankles, pulling them down into the churning tide of despair. The air thickened, crackling with energy that pricked at their skin like needles, each breath becoming shallow, the pressure mounting like a storm. As they moved forward, the ground trembled, a low growl vibrating from its depths, like an angry beast awakened. They ventured further in, the light flickering more erratically, like a dying ember fighting against the dark. Then, the shadows recoiled and surged, the whispers intensifying, a sinister melody rising from nothingness. "Come back, come play." And it seemed as if the shadows held their own memories too, stretching their hands as if to call the lost souls back into the depths of their realm. An unnerving mist began to seep in, gnarly tendrils curling around their legs, Carrie's twisted echoes of laughter, and muffled cries that tugged at their sanity. Clara glanced over her shoulder, heart racing as she spotted grotesque figures. Within the shifting fog, their faces layered with sorrow and despair. With each blink, they morphed, a child one moment, an adult the next, all bearing vacant stares and distorted mouths that chattered incoherently, their eyes pools of desperation, sinking into a void that seemed to go on forever. "We need to keep moving," Jake urged, his voice strained, barely breaking through the blanket of terror that enveloped them. The shadows hissed, the sound sharp, bitter, almost mocking, as if they reveled in the darkness, clinging to their hearts. "What do they want?" Beck whispered, his eyes darting around, impatience crashing against surges of anxiety. With every shadow that shifted, Clara could sense they watched, feasting on their fear, waiting with bated breath, their whispers wrapping around her mind, tucking into the recesses of her thoughts, blur of shadows tricking her with suggestions. "You're not strong enough. You'll never escape." And suddenly, she could hear her own heartbeat, louder than before, thumping in her ears like a war drum. The further they advanced, the deeper the shadows grew, turning vibrant colors into ghostly hues. Life siphoned away, fading into whispering silence. Along the path, the darkness thickened, stretching forth as if it had a pulse of its own. Here, reality twisted like a funhouse mirror, and each shadow taunted, flickering images, memories of all the things they had lost. A glimpse of a vibrant sunset dashed with smiling faces, faded into grotesque parodies of itself, twisting into gnarled trees, branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at their clothes, pulling them deeper into the abyss. Clara stumbled, her breath catching as she landed on the cold ground, that same pressure tightening around her chest, compression like waves of an undertow, dragging her down into an emptiness, threatening to swallow her whole. Everything around them pulsated, with life stolen from each flicker of hope, every gasp cloaked in agony fraught with despair. Jake didn't stop. He kept pulling her forward, but in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty danced, and for a terrifying moment, Clara feared they would unravel, stripped bare against this insidious darkness. Then a shrill laugh echoed through the gloom. Multiple voices layered like a twisted chorus, seeping into their bones, spreading like a disease. "You can't run from us." It pierced through their defenses, slicing into their hearts, lingering, and everything felt as if it slowed. The ground beneath them gave way to a disjointed roar, and shadows converged with overwhelming force, the darkness closing in like smoke, suffocating flames. "Stay together," Beck yelled, but his voice was lost, drowned in the cacophony that threatened to consume them. The figures danced on the fringe of sanity, mocking faces frozen in torment, stretching mouths that quivered with promises. "Join us, we won't let you go." A blinding light erupted around them, illuminating what lay at the end of the path, a haunting visage of everything they loathed and loved, beckoning them to linger, to dive into the shadows, and surrender, where clarity dissolved into chaos. A cacophony rose around them, the shadows tightening their grip, their whispers crawling into every crevice, twisting past memories until they morphed into exquisite webs of nightmares, dotting every warm moment with a chilling reminder of misery. And then the ground rumbled. The air crackled with electric fear as something monstrous broke free from the depths beneath them, its roar resonating like thunder, the walls shaking like an angry beast awakening, the darkness pulsing with an insatiable hunger. Clara's heart pounded wildly, each thump fueling her instinct to flee, to escape those malignant fingers scraping, ever closer, threatening to drag them into oblivion. "Run!" she screamed, the urgency snapping through the terror as they broke into a chaotic sprint. But the shadows laughed, high-pitched shrieks that sliced like knives, their voices trailing after them, a reminder of their relentless pursuit. With every step, it felt as though the ground was alive, clutching their feet, the pull growing deeper, a magnetic force drawing them back to the sins of their pasts. The figures around them morphed into familiar scenes, a friend turned enemy, the betrayal rising like bile. In the back of her throat, the path twisted cruelly, snaking into a thick, impenetrable fog, the light behind them, slowly fading, dimly throbbing. Like a dying star, Clara reached for Jake, her fingers brushing against his arm, but he flickered in and out of focus, as though he too was becoming part of the dark. "We can't lose each other," she gasped, pulling him closer into the abyss. But the void chuckled, and the shadows twisted around them tighter, glaring eyes peering from the depths, taunting their every attempt to shake this crushing grip. The path ahead began to shift, unraveling like a frayed thread, each step pressing them deeper into a ground that swirled and writhed, threatening to collapse underfoot. Clara's thoughts raced ahead, scrambling to formulate a plan, her heart pounding louder than the memory of what lay behind. The laughter, the shift among friends, the moments lost among whispers of betrayal. But that was only a shadow of what came next. As the void surged forward, its shape morphed, churning in unease, the shadows swirling violently, becoming an unrecognizable mass of despair strung tight like a taut string. With each passing moment, the shadows thickened until they pressed against their bodies, enveloping them in a suffocating embrace. The overwhelming urge to cry out resonated, but the air turned into syrup, clogging up her throat, muting the sound, a feeble whisper. Clara felt their memories unravel, old experiences twisting backwards, spinning, until they crafted a cycle of unending sorrow. The deeper the shadows tangled, the more lost they would become. Isolation pressed like a vice, helping the shadows spiral to feeding frenzy. See, the voices echoed with malice, mimicking former friends with rancid glee. "This is who you are, where you always belong." The words tangled around them, gripping tighter with each syllable, until every breath felt like a battle. Every heartbeat echoed a reminder to yield, to worship, to surrender to the weight of forgotten promises. And still their light flickered, fighting against the tide, fighting against the shadows, pulling away. A spark ignited within Clara's core, even as limbs threatened to collapse, each surge of energy igniting her will. "We're not lost yet," she cried, her voice breaking through the tumult, a defiance weaving through their fears. And at that moment, the shadows pulled back, just enough to let them glimpse the truth. With their eyes wide open, they saw it. Behind them, the snare of darkness, glaring like a hungry beast that thrived on despair. Yet within the shadows, at the very edge, was a glimmer, a chance to reclaim it all, a chance to step aside and blaze anew. And so, they fought against the swarm, pulling each other with all they had, walking a precarious line between light and dark, whispers becoming songs of unbroken promises, each heartbeat a thunderous roar. In that moment, with the shadows screaming behind, Clara felt hope surge through her, the glow of their courage burning bright. And in the depths of her soul, she understood they weren't doing this alone. They had entered this nightmare together, and together they would find a way to fight back. But that spark was fragile, like a candle flickering in a storm, and the shadows sensed it, a dark laughter swelling among them, echoing off the twisted walls, a dissonant melody that clawed at their sanity. Each breath they took seemed to weaken, to lend energy to the writhing tendrils, stretching and curling as if alive, hungry for despair and strife. "Stick together," Jake shouted, but his voice trembled as he dug his nails into Clara's hand, the warmth of her skin turning ice cold. With every step forward, the shadows closed in, blurring the edges of their reality. Like watercolor bleeding on a page, shapes melding into one another, faces flickering with twisted familiarity. They pressed onward, the air growing thicker, every heartbeat pounding in their ears, the laughter morphing into cruel taunts. "You think you can escape? You're part of us now." The echoes wrapped around Clara's mind, embedding themselves into her thoughts, turning her resolve into shards of doubt. How long could they persevere when the very essence of their past whispered poison into their souls? Then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath them, cracking open like an ancient tomb, a gaping maw swallowing dark light. The figures began to emerge, wretched memories dressed in shadow, each one a different version of regret. The faces of her childhood friends, elongated and twisted in agony, their voices a terrifying cacophony. "You left us, you abandoned us." The sound rolled through the air, a mournful lament that tugged at her heart. "No, I didn't mean to," Clara cried out, fingers clutching at the air, trying to grasp any remnant of reality. But the shadows lunged, a whirlwind of despair dragging her closer to their suffocating embrace. "You were never here for us," they screeched, panic rising as the memories tried to yank her into their depths, the swirling darkness merging with her, until every connection unraveled, and she felt herself becoming one with the tormenting shadows. "Stay with me," Beck yelled again, his body trembling, eyes wide with panic. But it was getting harder to maintain focus. Clara felt the pull of the abyss, its clammy fingers curling around her throat, each breath turning into a struggle. "Fight it," Jake urged, his voice barely rising above the din. But even as he pulled her sideways, the darkness seeped into her ears, swelling with tantalizing promises. A fleeting moment of warmth, moments long gone now shrouded in fear, the kind of love and belonging that sent tendrils of longing through her veins. She thought she saw her mother's face, among the shadows, lips moving, silently, words tangled within the chaos, until a darkness threatened everything. She believed she knew. "Your weakness makes us stronger," the shadows whispered, each word dripping like venom, twisting in on itself until it formed a net of despair around them, entwining their bodies as it yanked the last shreds of light away. Then came the silence, deafening and heavy, pressing down until she could hardly breathe. The figures loomed, swirling closer, their faces wrestling with distorted anger and pain, muffled cries clawing at her consciousness. Clara felt herself drowning, every breath becoming a fragmented plea, and she squeezed her eyes shut, whispering quiet prayers to every memory worth saving. This can't be the end. She could feel it. This wasn't just darkness. It was something alive, an ancient force wrapping around their souls. A pulse of vengeance thudding like a heartbeat. Suddenly the ground trembled again, and beneath the swirling fog, she could glimpse a shimmer of light, a heart of gold amidst the shadows, calling out to her, and with it a flicker of truth came crashing through the chaos. The light wasn't about victory or escape, but acceptance, understanding, the warmth in reclaiming the past. Every regret, every loss woven into strength. Clara felt the music swell, the the rhythm powering through her veins, rising above the cacophony, and she focused on the light, drunk on its sweetness. The shadows recoiling for the first time, Prophet absorbing into themselves as they shrieked, their whispers turning frantic, and her resolve hardened. With newfound conviction and clarity, she took a step toward the glimmering halo. The shadows, though pressing, seemed to pause in disbelief. Time around them warped, the air thick with dread, as they tore relentlessly at her sanity. "I will not forget," she declared with a voice forged in fire, shaking fists at the abyss that had claimed her. "I carry these memories. They do not define me. They shape me." The very echo of her words seemed to create ripples in the suffocating air, and the shadows faltered. Uncertainty splashed across their distorted faces, the hunger in their eyes fading for a brief moment, glistening with confusion instead of rage. "Push back," Jake's voice rallied, resonating against the cold dampness, as their fear became a collective strength, unifying them as they surged toward the light. The swirling darkness writhed, the edges of their light shimmering like silver strands. Spreading outwards, the shadows howled and roared, the cacophony rising into a fever pitch, writhing and recoiling as the whispers turned into screams. "You can't escape us." But they found strength in togetherness. Clara could feel it coursing, filling up the empty spaces left behind, the shadows retreating, whispers faltering as the light grew louder. And just when it seemed they would dissolve, bathed in light, the shadows struck back, straining against the walls they had built, the foundation cracking beneath their feet, and the figures twisted and morphed, a whirlwind of souls dragging them into despair. "You will never leave," the voices shrieked, and in that moment, everything shifted, the ground giving way to a yawning chasm below, drawing them in with a magnetic pull, the very fabric of reality, tearing apart as they fell, plummeting into darkness. The sensation was suffocating, rushing through them like an endless void, the whispers becoming a cacophony of screams. And Clara reached for her friends, their hands grasping desperately, as the shadows followed, trailing like smoke, a haunting reminder of their deepest fears, lingering on the edge of their memories. And even as they descended, the light flickered in the distance, growing brighter as they plummeted, the warmth spreading out, like golden tendrils reaching for them. But the grasp of the shadows tugged harder, an insistent pull dragging them down, insinuating that there would be no escape, that they were destined to remain part of the darkness, to be consumed by the memories that haunted. Each turn, each breath, Clara twisted and turned, the air becoming thick with dread, the shadows gripping tighter, their fingers clawing as they broke apart, energy draining, the light flickering dangerously low. "Hold on," Beck yelled, his voice thunderous amidst the chaos. But their faith began to waver. The shadows felt like cold teeth against her skin, and they threatened to shatter the very essence of who they were. Reality became twisted in the chaos, moments of fear flashing in front of them, a kaleidoscope of nightmares, overtaking her senses, each one a reminder of what lay just beyond reach. Each blink sent time spinning, the shifting ground morphing underfoot, darkness clawing at the corners of their minds, laughter mixed with desperate pleas, wounded souls echoing within. But Clara felt the light pulse, the energy resonating stronger, and as she was yanked further into the void, something inside her cracked free, igniting a fire that threatened to consume them all. "Fight," she shouted, her voice cutting through the echo of despair, piercing the veil of shadows as clarity. Rush back, the realization of who they were, what they could be, surged through her. Together, they were unbreakable, and as the light brightened, the shadows howled, their lamentation rising against the onslaught. She could feel the weight lifting, the pull growing weaker. "We are memories," Clara whispered fiercely, "not your puppets to control." The resolve of the group solidified, pushing against the shadows with renewed vigor, their collective energy shifting, tamping down fear and dread, and redirecting it toward the light. Uninhibited, they let their voices soar, full of promise and courage. And as each flicker of light grew, the shadows shrieked in frustration, their grasp faltering just enough for clarity to seep in. Perhaps in the dark they could reclaim the very essence of themselves, separate the lessons from the scars, rebuild the fractured memories, turning despair into strength, each voice ratifying their collective memory. And as they surged forward, the shadows began to shudder, their darkness flickering like dying embers, almost lifeless as they pulled back, each tendril giving way, revealing more glimmers of light ahead. Whether it was real or imagined, the glowing halo beckoned, and with a shared glance, steel in their resolve, they launched toward it together, the final darkness swirling around them. This time, they would not falter. This time, they would not yield. As they propelled themselves toward the light, Clara felt the shadows shift again, a chill creeping into the air, the whispers turning sinister, flickering like a flame caught in a draft. Each step forward sank deeper into dread, the reality around them warping, the light flickering uncertainly, as if it could feel their hesitation. With every heartbeat, the ground beneath them felt alive, pulsing, undulating like something vast and hungry. Clara's heart raced. She could almost hear it, a low hum vibrating through her bones, echoing the very essence of fear. The shadows danced around them, feeding off their anxiety, and reality began to twist further, memories splintering into grotesque visions. A sickening stench invaded the air, like rotting flesh mixed with the scent of damp earth. Clara covered her mouth, but even the light dimmed in reaction. From the periphery, dark forms began to emerge, figures they had once recognized, their faces stretched into distorted grins, eyes hollow and glassy, mouths twisted in glee, whispering promises wrapped in silk, the very essence of despair. "Don't look at them," Beck's voice came, strained and barely a whisper. But it was too late. Clara's gaze slipped sideways, and the moment their eyes locked, the figures jerked forward, dragging their tired souls closer. It felt as if they were being sucked into a void, the weight of despair anchoring them in place, bonding them with the shadows. "They'll take us," Jake shouted, an edge of panic splintering his tone. "We have to keep moving." Clara fought the urge to scream as the figures reached out, cold fingers brushing against her skin, the sensation urging despair deeper, each caress a reminder of failures, the laughter echoing in the vastness, a mocking symphony entwining with silence. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath her shifted again, cracks unfolding like veins, and with each fracture, more of the darkness seeped through, a terrifying ink blot spreading, until it unveiled shapes twisted beyond recognition, bodies suspended in despair, faces twisted into silent screams. Clara's breath hitched as the shadows began reaching upward, the air thickening with the weight of memories, grasping at her ankles, trying to tug her under. "Stay together," Beck cried again, but the span of darkness loomed, hovering at the edges of their existence. And soon, the faces of the shadows morphed, taking on their features, eyes so much like their own, the life snuffed out, each mirroring fear as she staggered back, the sickening realization hitting. They were becoming them, those who had once suffered, devoured by the very memories they feared. Clara shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts, but each twist of her mind unveiled fragments from long ago, bitter arguments, betrayals, the sense of isolation that pulled at her soul, echoes of names whispered like secrets, the tightness curling deeper inside her, each heartbeat flashing before her eyes. Time unraveled, fingers reaching into eternity. It felt endless and unyielding, the darkness woven with threads of anguish. As the shadows began to weave a cocoon around them, thick and suffocating, and as Beck pulled Jake closer, the shadows hissed, pinching the air until it was sharp with fear. With each breath, the weight grew heavier, Their connection tugged tighter, but the glimmer of light ahead seemed to pulse. It was a beacon of hope flickering between despair. They were at a precipice, the thin line between the light and dark, and as uncertainty slithered back, Clara felt the shadows claw at her will. Their laughter a haunting lullaby, promising a return to something. "Fight it," Beck shouted, as if he could hear her thoughts, and she concentrated, gathering strength from the flicker of warmth that barely illuminated her heart. The laughter morphed, turning shrill and insistent. "Join us. Be one with us." The voices layered over one another, thickening the atmosphere until it pressed against her chest. Desperation surged inside her as she shut her eyes tightly, trying to push them away, but the panic clawed back. "Please let us go," Jake cried, his voice cracking in the choke of darkness. The shadows circling like vultures, hungry for their very essence. As the cocoon tightened, binding them, its cold embrace suffocated every flicker of hope. Clara opened her eyes, the shadows now swirling like a storm, blinding and fierce, a twisted cyclone forcing her toward oblivion, deeper into the abyss of despair. In moments of clarity, she could see the glimmer again, a flash in the distance like a fading star, its brightness calling to her. But it was too far. The weight of the shadows pressed down more, pulling her into the depths of their anguish, a bitter symphony of pain resounding around her, as echoes of those lost brushed against her skin, haunting images of her past flickering like candles. Fragments dulled her senses, and she realized the shadows spoke her truth, tinged with longing and dread. Each tale a reminder of the loneliness, a voracious hunger consuming the light, swallowing hope until nothing remained. Despair threatened to envelope them whole. Clara fought against the grip, tearing at the tendrils of darkness, her heart pounding with the need to break free, each cry echoing louder than the last. "We are not yours." But the shadows only twisted further, their laughter rising till it drowned her voice. "You cannot escape what you are. Fear is your essence, and in the dark is where you belong." Clara felt the truth of the words wrapped around her, fingers sinking deeper within, clawing at the edges of her sanity. Hunger, despair, and regret, intertwined into something terrifying. The very fabric of her soul threatened to unravel, and she could feel it. The darkness wanted her. The pull toward the cocoon grew heavier, and suddenly darkness erupted as a wave swept toward them, and they reeled back, the shadows clambering eagerly for a taste of flesh. Clara's instinct screamed, "Run!" But with every pulse of energy emanating from them, the shadows solidified, and as they pushed closer, all hope felt like it was slipping away. They were on a razor's edge, suspended between despair and light. And as the darkness lunged forward, Clara felt a jolt of adrenaline coursing through her. "No," she cried, the words ripping through the cacophony of fear, as she reached out and grasped Beck's hand, her heart pounding against her ribs, a white-hot fury igniting within her. "Together," she shouted, the word ringing authoritative, reverberating through the chaos around them. But would it be enough? As they all clutched one another, the echoes of laughter grew loud, the shadows inching nearer, each breath escalating into uncertainty. Cocoon peeling tighter, and the realization struck. This was their moment, the clash between light and dark, the final battle against what they feared most. With newfound clarity, Clara pushed the tingling energy channeling through, reaching deep to find the glimmer of courage within. And as the shadows lunged, the light flickered violently, sending ripples through the darkness, and her fist fell upon the ground, the very essence of anger laced through, the moment becoming electric. "This ends here," she bellowed, and her words surged with strength, shaking the very foundation of existence. As the shadows recoiled, the bright light erupting, unleashing a blinding wave against the encroaching darkness. For an instant, the shadows faltered, faces melting away like shadows at dawn. And with that flicker of hope, Clara bolted forward, a primal scream escaping her lips, pushing into the fracture of light, the shadows swirling desperately around her, mocking, howling, as she fought against the tide that threatened to drag her back, willing that beacon to pull them through, to redeem them from the clammy grasp of the memories spiraling into despair. As she surged forward, the cacophony of voices screamed in outrage, the shadows lunging to reclaim their hold. But under her raw determination, she felt the ground breaking free, the crack widening into a chasm of light. And from behind her, Beck's voice resonated. "Don't stop, keep pushing." It sounded like the clarity of hope itself, his words intermingling with the thrum of energy. And slowly the shadows began to retreat, distorted faces writhing against the glow. As she reached for the horizon of light, her vision narrowing to that flicker, and with every ounce of strength that remained, she propelled herself deeper, determined to leave the darkness behind, to reclaim the essence of who they were meant to be. But the shadows turned desperate, their forms rolling and shifting. Like smoke, darkness clawing at her throat, its grip tightening with fury. And as Clara tilted on the verge of the light, she felt the tendrils of terror curling around her, the very essence of fear threatening to consume her. The chilling memory of grief intensified, haunting snippets of laughter wrapped in despair, each memory taunting her with what they had lost. Clara felt her heart heavy in her chest, in that moment of darkness closing in, but as the weight pressed harder, she glimpsed flare amidst the shadows, almost like they trembled, their malevolence wavering. With a surge of resolve, she pulled every fragment of strength she could muster and roared back into the darkness. "You don't hold me anymore." The words echoed over the abyss, clinging as they resonated against the shadows, the very force of her while forcing a crack. And in that fleeting moment, the shadows began to peel back, exposing the light, its warmth surging through her. But just as she thought she could break free, the darkness lashed out, sinking in her thoughts. Even the flicker waned under threat. Within her mind's eye, nightmares spilled into view, entangling around her heart. And before she could resist, the shadows whispered the unspoken fears, each echo a resonance of despair that beckoned her home. "They will leave you," the darkness hissed. "They will abandon you again." And clarity flickered uncertainly. Her breath hitched, begging her to give in, to let go of everything, all hope stretching thin until it felt like a taut wire ready to snap. Clara's thoughts swirled in turmoil, but she fought against the clamoring voices, her fingers trembling as she grasped tightly, fighting every image of what could have been, every regret flaring before her, their intoxicating embrace tugging at her, the fear of losing her friends clawing at her heart. But the light was there, radiating with intensity, desperate to guide her back. And with one last surge of will, she loomed toward it, reaching out against the shadows that mocked her. And she would not falter. "Together," she yelled, as she reached for Beck, her fingers brushing against his. And as the shadows lunged again, everything fell silent, the cacophony of whispers drowning. In the collective resolve that surged within her, the tether solidifying like an unbreakable bond, binding the four of them against the encroaching void. At that moment, she felt the shadows shriek with fury, as if they could taste the light's lure, the brightness expanding, tearing through the darkness like a knife, each pulse pushing against the night. And as they propelled forward, together, strands of their souls intertwining, the resonance of their courage, enveloping them in warmth. "We'll fight together. We'll find our way," Clara shouted, flooded with an energy that coursed through their joined hands, the shadows recoiling like waves retreating from the shore. In that moment, something shifted. The darkness pulsated, a living entity writhing with anger, its whispers morphing into a cacophony of dread, echoing around them like the chilling howl of a winter wind. The shadows twisted, thickening into grotesque shapes that flitted at the edge of their vision. Each one a memory turned monstrous, faces half-formed, mouth stretching wide with silent screams. Just then, Beck stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror as one shadow reached out, long fingers grasping for his throat, seeking to pull him back into the depths they had fought so hard against. "No!" "Beck!" Clara screamed. Their bond flickered as he struggled, the light dimming with every second he was pulled away. The rest of them grasped harder, but the darkness twisted tighter, squeezing the very air from their lungs. Clara felt her heart race, desperation clawing inside her. She couldn't let the shadows win. The fog of darkness stretched, cloaking her senses like a suffocating blanket, and as she turned to help Beck, the air shifted, cold and damp. Through the swirling shadows, figures began to take form, each silhouette more grotesque than the last, with hollow eyes gazing into her soul, their mouths contorting into silent cries for help. The shadows shimmered, shifting and laughing with a sound like broken glass, a laughter that echoed her greatest fears. Clara's instincts screamed to run, but each step forward felt heavier, an unseen weight anchoring her to the spot. She looked around, and her friends appeared trapped in their own nightmare, a visceral tableau of terror as the shadows clawed at their resolve. "We have to focus," Beck yelled, but the shadows lunged, silencing him, as a thick tendril wrapped around his waist, dragging him deeper into the murky void. Clara felt a surge of fear, but this time it was different. The others were watching, wide-eyed and filled with dread, and she knew that the light they had created was in great danger of flickering out completely. The darkness churned, the temperature dropping as a chill spread around them, its presence wrapping around their minds. The sinister whispers of past regrets echoing louder. "You have failed them." Clara's breath quickened. The shadows were creeping closer, and the suffocating weight pressed against her heart, with scenes of loss flooding her mind. Memories of laughter, friends around a fire, soft whispers shared in the dark, and pain threatening to overwhelm her as shadows twisted into familiar faces, taunting her with glimpses of what was lost, what could never be reclaimed. "You don't deserve to escape," they murmured, seeping into her thoughts alongside the terror. Beck suddenly fell to his knees, the weight of despair pulling him down, as tendrils wrapped tighter around his limbs, their whispers sinking deep within, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of their light. Help me, please!" His voice broke, echoing through the vast emptiness. Clara felt a chill crawl down her spine, a bone-deep awareness that if she didn't act fast, they would be consumed, lost forever in the hungry darkness that craved their essence. Fear clawed painfully, but she clung to the bond they shared, the flicker of hope now nestled in her chest, the light they had forged refusing to give in. "We're stronger than this," she shouted, clenching her jaw, summoning every ounce of strength. "Together, we can do this." The shadows recoiled, momentarily confused by her resolve. And in that breath, the faint light flickered once again, illuminating the swirling darkness, casting their grotesque features into sharp relief. With every bit of energy, Clara pushed against the tide, pulling Beck back toward her, the others flanking her like pillars of strength. Binding together, hearts beating in rhythm against the shadow's chill. As one, they channeled their memories. The laughter, the warmth, the love shared. Each recollection a thread in the tapestry of light they wove. And as they fought, the shadows shrieked, a sound that sent chills racing through the air, slicing through the sanguine essence that tethered them. The shadows began to writhe, twisting into more horrifying shapes, contorting into vengeful figures of past transgressions. Once recognizable faces now marred with unfathomable rage. And Clara's stomach twisted at the sight. The darkness wasn't just a void. It was them, their regrets made flesh, feeding off their fears. And they howled as they lunged, the faces shifting in and out like a nightmarish slideshow. The darkness clawed at her sanity, shadows spiraling around her, and she gasped as the chilling laughter filled her mind. Taunting, twisting, wrapping tightly, but with each pulse of courage coursing through them. Clara felt the frayed edges of doubt begin to fray, the shadows momentarily breaking, and Beck's voice pierced through. "Don't look away. Remember the light." With a fierce shout, Clara grasped the tendrils that held them, her fingers slipping through the cold, as she focused on that flicker of brightness burning within. But just as they seemed to gain ground, the shadows fought back violently, wrapping around her throat, squeezing with a relentless grip. The world began to fade. The laughter transformed into screams, a cauldron of anguish swirling faster, with shapes lunging, clawing, as the walls of existence began to cave in around their casting of light. Clara felt the overwhelming weight of despair sinking into her core, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. And just when it seemed hope was lost, her friends' voices rang out, resonating deep. "We're with you. Don't let go." Their presence tethered her, a lifeline of warmth amidst the cold, tightening shadows. And in that moment, as panic clawed at her mind, Clara's resolve solidified against the endless night, one thought echoing louder than all others. They mustn't stop fighting. The shadows blinked with rage, and for an instant, she could feel their strength shatter under the intensity of their bond. The light brighter than ever, stabbing through the darkness. And even as the shadows wrapped tightly, Clara roared with newfound ferocity. "Not today!" Their voices blended into a symphony of determination, bulldozing through the void, as the very essence of hope drove them forward, and the darkness surged against them, each tendril fighting like an angry storm. But from within the storm of fear, Clara embraced the light, and with her friends by her side, they charged forward, forcing the shadows back, the air swirling with a fierce energy, the boundary of light and shadow narrowing, fueled by every laugh shared, every moment where hope triumphed over fear. Then, in a final desperate stand, the shadows writhed and curled, their laughter turning into anguished howls, fading into echoes as the light consumed them. The very fabric of darkness fell apart, and with a pulse of blinding brilliance, Clara felt a shift in the air as she unshackled the tendrils of despair, sending shockwaves through the void, and with one final push, they burst through the surface of the darkness, into a realm of blinding light, the cocoon unraveling. But in that moment of freedom, the shadows reared back, the faces distorted and angry, breath hitching in her throat as something terrified twisted within her. They were not done yet. The darkness was alive, and it lingered waiting, like a predator in the night. And as they stood on the edge of this terrifying light, Clara felt its presence lurking just beyond the glimmer, the insidious sensation of being watched, the promise of darkness forever haunting their footsteps. The battle might have been won, but the war against their fears was far from over. Clara felt the weight of dread as she stood there, the blinding light around them flickering, like a candle threatened by an unforgiving wind. The air crackled with an energy that pulsed through her skin. But beneath that surface warmth, an icy grip threatened, the shadows clawing at the edges of her psyche. Even as they stood victorious, the shadows were not gone. They lingered like a bad smell in the corners of her mind. They had made it, but with each passing second, Clara could hear the whispers creeping back, those familiar voices that oozed through the cracks. "You can't escape us." The shadows had retreated, but she could feel them, nestled in the corners of her thoughts, waiting, hungry. The memory of faces twisted with rage, the laughter that echoed with malice, the secrets that marred their hearts, crept forward, tendrils of darkness like fingers squeezing around her throat. Beck shivered beside her, his expression haunted, fingers twitching as if grasping at phantoms. "Do you feel that?" he said, his voice trembling. The group huddled closer, the warmth from their earlier moments snuffed out, replaced by an unspeakable terror that wrapped around them, like a shroud beneath an endless night sky. They all exchanged glances, the weight of their shared experiences threatening to pull them down again. But this time, Clara was determined to fight it. "Stay together," she urged, though her heart beat thunderously in her chest. The darkness surged back, not in the tangible sense, but as a presence, a malevolence that chilled every nerve in her body. It felt unrelenting, forever capturing the essence of the fears they had faced. With every moment of quiet, the shadows began to flicker in the corners of her vision, like a film reel tearing at the seams. She glimpsed reflections of her past, moments of vulnerability transformed into dread incantations, the visions morphing into grotesque figures that reached for them, shattering the hope they had fought so hard to reclaim. "What do we do now?" whispered one of her friends, the tremor in her voice betraying the unearthing darkness hovering above them. Clara squeezed Beck's hand, wanting to draw strength from him, but the connection felt frail against the encroaching terror. The shadows began to swirl around them again, a creeping fog that thickened the air, and the creeping silence that followed was more unsettling than the screams. "We fight it," she asserted, more to herself than anyone else. "We can't let it in." Just as she spoke, an exhalation curled around them, an icy breath that whispered secrets long buried, echoes of regrets that made their hearts palpitate, drumming louder and louder until it drowned out all other thoughts. They formed a circle, arms entwined. Clara could feel the warmth of their skin against hers, and the strength it gave her. In the face of the insidious assault, the light they had once wielded flickered, and panic surged as shadows crept closer, snaking beneath their feet, whispering words of despair, images of the unthinkable materializing in front of them, the visions of friends lost to the inky void, the dreadful weight of darkness pressing down. And just as it seemed it would consume them, Clara took a deep breath, embracing the fear. "Remember who we are," she shouted, as though her voice would drown out the shadows. But the earth shook beneath their feet, the foundational ground breaking apart, the shadows intertwining with the soil itself, wrapping around their ankles like vines, tightening inexorably. The darkness pulled at their essence, and Clara felt panic seize her. "Focus on what we fought for, on each other," she shouted desperately, seeking to ignite passion, to kindle hope within the gathering storm. But the tendrils coiled tighter, the whispers rising like a crescendo, paralyzing them with images of lost dreams. The faces of every person they'd left behind. One by one, her friend's eyes widened in terror as the memories flooded back. Shadows of their lost loved ones danced around them. Their silent pleas echoed in incoherent tones, every wisp weaving dread that threatened to outweigh their unity. Clara could feel their strength wavering, the weight of darkness pressing harder. And in that critical moment, time stood still as she understood. This fight was not just against an external force, but against the despair within themselves. Every shadow was a reflection of their deepest fears, a personification of the demons they had faced, but had never truly conquered. The air shimmered as they stood amidst the chaos, and against that backdrop of sorrow, Clara summoned every ounce of light within herself, the flickering candle at the center of their gathering storm, revealing a path. "We still have each other," she cried, her voice cutting through the cacophony of pain. "We will not be consumed." With that declaration, she reached forward, slicing through the shadows, the air splitting, the tendrils recoiling, as clarity illuminated her thoughts. "Hold on to the light," Beck echoed, his voice resonating with newfound courage. And together they drew strength from their shared resolve, from years of laughter, tears, heartache, and triumph. The shadows, for the first time, flickered uncertainly, as weakness crept in where darkness had once ruled. Clara felt the shift, the weight of despair loosening its grip as they held tighter, the light within them brighter than anything they had faced, piercing the inky void like 1,000 stars exploding. Then she unleashed a battle cry, every ounce of love and memory flooding into that moment, the shadows recoiling into themselves, forgotten whispers scattering. As the darkness dimmed, the air crackling with residual energy, The final scream echoed as the darkness dissolved, absorbing the memories into the light. And as it did, Clara felt the warmth envelop them, filling the empty void where darkness had lingered too long. As the shadows fled, surrendering to the brilliance, the last echoes of despair faded into silence, leaving a hollow emptiness behind. But now it felt clean, open to possibilities. They stood together, hearts pounding, surrounded by shimmering traces of light, the echoes of darkness and self-doubt dissipating into nothingness. Clara let go of Beck's hand, a mix of relief and exhaustion flooding through her. Yet the unease bubbled beneath the surface, reminding her that the darkness was forever lurking just a breath away. Looking at her friends, Clara realized they had survived, but the journey was never truly over. That this victory, however hard won, demanded vigilance. The world ahead felt precarious, the air thick with latent fear, and the shadows hinted that they would always be waiting. They had faced the terrifying tide and claimed a moment of peace. But the creeping sensation that coaxed them into uncertainty lingered. The threats were never gone, and that knowledge clung to her like an unwanted cloak. With one final glance into the depths of the shadows, she made a promise. They would be ready, always ready, to face whatever sinister specter lurked in the abyss. Together, they stepped forward, the weight of their past echoing behind them, but now coupled with a fierce loyalty that bound them. A thin thread of connection refusing to fray, bringing light and warmth that would stand against the rising shadows, no matter how terrifying they become.